There was no shouting, no broken dishes, no slammed doors echoing through the house, no neighbors peeking through curtains, no dramatic goodbye, only silence. The kind of silence that settles into the walls of a home until even the floorboards seem afraid to creak. On an autumn evening in a quiet Vermont town, 18 years after the worst mistake of his life, Daniel Mercer lay awake beside the woman he had loved for nearly 3 decades. Outside, rain tapped softly against the bedroom window. The maple trees swayed under a cold October wind, their last golden leaves surrendering one by one to the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn drifted across the valley, low and lonely, before disappearing into the night. The house was warm. The marriage wasn't. Daniel stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar rhythm of Claire's breathing. She wasn't asleep. After 18 years, he knew the difference. She had perfected the art of pretending. Pretending she wasn't awake. Pretending she wasn't remembering. Pretending the silence between them didn't occupy more space than the king-sized bed they shared every night. It had become their routine. They still shared a home. They still shared holidays. They still raised a daughter together. They still laughed at family dinners and smiled in Christmas photographs that fooled everyone who saw them. But there was one thing they hadn't shared in 18 years. Each other, not the way husbands and wives were meant to. Daniel turned his head just enough to look at Claire's silhouette. Moonlight spilled through the curtains, tracing the outline of the woman who had once reached for his hand before she fell asleep every night. She no longer did, not because she hated him. Hatred would have been easier. Hatred burns hot. Silence freezes everything. For years, he had convinced himself that time healed all wounds. Then 5 years passed, then 10, then 15. Before he realized it, 18 birthdays, 18 anniversaries, 18 Christmas mornings and 18 New Year's kisses that never happened had quietly slipped away. Time hadn't healed anything. It had simply taught them how to live around the pain. Daniel swallowed hard. Tonight was different. Their daughter Sophie was getting married in 3 weeks. Earlier that evening, she'd called with the excitement only a bride could have. "Dad, Mom, promise me something." "Anything," Daniel had answered without hesitation. "When the band starts playing after my first dance, I want you two to dance together. I want everyone to see the kind of love I grew up believing in." Those words had lodged in his chest like a stone. Because Sophie believed she had grown up watching a beautiful marriage. She hadn't. She had grown up watching 2 decent people protect her from a broken one. Daniel closed his eyes. He wondered how many lies children inherit without ever hearing a single dishonest word. Beside him, Claire shifted slightly, pulling the blanket closer around her shoulders. The movement was so small, so ordinary. Yet Daniel noticed it because for 18 years, every tiny movement from her had mattered more than any spoken sentence. Silence teaches people to become experts in details. A longer pause before answering. A deeper sigh while washing dishes. A smile that never quite reached the eyes. The distance between 2 coffee mugs on the kitchen counter. The side of the couch someone chooses. The inch someone leaves between their shoulder and yours while watching a movie. Love, he had learned, wasn't the only language people spoke. Distance had its own vocabulary, and Claire had become fluent. He slowly turned onto his side. For the first time in years, he let himself hope. Maybe because Sophie was getting married. Maybe because life suddenly felt shorter than it used to. Maybe because regret becomes heavier with age. Carefully, almost timidly, Daniel reached across the space between them. His fingers brushed the back of Claire's hand. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. For one impossible heartbeat, he believed 18 years of silence might finally be ending. Then Claire gently lifted his hand. Not angrily, not coldly, simply, carefully, as though she were returning something that no longer belonged to her. She placed his hand back on his own side of the bed. Neither of them spoke. The rain continued outside. Finally, without turning to face him, she whispered into the darkness. "You stopped being my husband 18 years ago." Daniel felt every word settle over him like fresh snow. Claire took a slow breath before continuing. "I just never stopped being your family." Nothing else followed. No accusation, no bitterness, no tears. Just the quiet truth she had carried alone for almost 2 decades. Daniel covered his face with trembling hands. For the first time since the night he betrayed her, he understood something devastating. Claire had never spent 18 years trying to punish him. She had spent 18 years trying to survive the version of herself that died the night she discovered the affair. And suddenly, the story was no longer about the woman who stayed. It became the story of everything that remained unsaid after she did. Welcome back to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. If you're new here, you're joining a community that believes the most powerful stories don't just entertain, they change the way we see love, trust, forgiveness, and ourselves. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, Do you think silence can hurt more than shouting? Or is leaving always the healthier choice after betrayal? We'd love to hear your thoughts, because every perspective adds something meaningful to the conversation. And if you enjoy emotionally rich American love stories filled with life lessons that stay with you long after the ending, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Now, let's go back 18 years. To the night when one mistake changed everything, and one woman's silence became louder than any scream ever could. The first snow of December arrived quietly in Maple Hollow, Vermont. It always did. No dramatic storms, no howling winds, just delicate white flakes drifting from a pale grey sky, settling over rooftops, church steeples, and winding country roads, until the whole town looked as though someone had wrapped it in fresh linen. Daniel Mercer stood outside Mercer Family Books, a small independent bookstore that had served Maple Hollow for nearly 40 years. He balanced 2 paper cups of coffee in one hand, while adjusting the scarf around his neck with the other. At 42, Daniel had the kind of face people instinctively trusted. His sandy brown hair had begun surrendering to streaks of grey at the temples, giving him a distinguished appearance his students often joked made him look more like a college professor than a high school history teacher. He smiled easily, held doors open for strangers, remembered birthdays, volunteered during community events. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, Daniel Mercer had earned something increasingly rare. Respect. The bookstore door chimed as he stepped inside. Warm air, rich with the scent of coffee and old pages, welcomed him. Behind the front counter, Claire Mercer was helping an elderly customer search for a novel she'd read 20 years earlier but couldn't remember the title of. Claire never rushed people. She asked questions, listened carefully, smiled with her eyes before her lips. Within minutes, she'd placed the exact book into the woman's hands. "Oh, honey," the customer laughed. "You always know." Claire grinned. "I just pay attention." Daniel watched quietly. That was Claire. She noticed everything. The customer turned toward Daniel. "Morning, handsome." "Morning, Mrs. Franklin." She winked. "You'd better take good care of this woman. There aren't many like her left." Daniel looked at Claire with genuine warmth. "I know." Mrs. Franklin gathered her shopping bag before smiling knowingly. "You two still make marriage look easy." Daniel answered automatically. "We're doing our best." The woman left, ringing the brass bell above the door one final time. Silence settled over the bookstore. Daniel walked toward Claire and placed one coffee beside her. "Vanilla latte." She smiled. "You remembered." "I always remember." She nodded softly. "I know." On the surface, it was an ordinary exchange. Comfortable, familiar. Exactly what people expected from a couple married nearly 20 years. Yet, if someone had watched closely enough, they would have noticed something missing. Daniel didn't kiss her hello. Claire didn't lean into him. Their hands never brushed while exchanging the coffee. There wasn't awkwardness. There wasn't tension. Only distance. A distance so practiced, it looked natural. Across town, Maple Hollow High School buzzed with students preparing for winter break. Daniel's classroom walls were covered with maps, historical photographs, and handwritten quotes from famous American leaders. His students adored him, not because he made history easy, because he made history feel alive. Standing before the class, Daniel held up a faded Civil War photograph. "What do you think history remembers?" he asked. Hands shot into the air. "The winners. The presidents. The wars." Daniel smiled. "Sometimes." He carefully placed the photograph back onto his desk. "But history also remembers the moments people wish had never happened." The classroom fell unusually quiet. Daniel continued. "One decision can echo across generations. That's why every choice matters, even the ones nobody else sees." Several students nodded while taking notes. Daniel continued the lesson, but for reasons he couldn't explain. Those words lingered inside him long after the bell rang. Meanwhile, Claire drove across town toward Maple Hollow Children's Hospital, where she volunteered every Thursday afternoon reading stories to young patients. She could have spent the afternoon resting. Business at the bookstore had been busy. Instead, she walked room to room carrying books almost as lovingly as some people carried flowers. 5-year-old Lily waited impatiently beneath a dinosaur blanket. "You came." "I promised I would." "You never forget." Claire laughed. "No." She sat beside Lily and opened Charlotte's Web. Halfway through the chapter, Lily interrupted. "Miss Claire?" "Yes?" "Why are you always happy?" Claire blinked. It wasn't a question adults usually asked. She closed the book gently. "I'm not always happy." "You smile a lot." Claire looked toward the snowy window. "Sometimes smiling is how people help other people feel safe." Lily accepted the answer with the uncomplicated wisdom children possess. I like your smile. Claire's eyes softened. I'm glad. She resumed reading. But inside, something tightened, because children often believed smiles meant happiness. Adults knew better. That evening, the Mercer home glowed beneath strings of white Christmas lights. Their daughter Sophie burst through the front door carrying shopping bags and enough energy to warm the entire house. Mom! Claire looked up from the kitchen. How'd finals go? I survived. Daniel entered carrying groceries. Barely. Sophie rolled her eyes. Dad exaggerates. I teach teenagers. Exaggeration is self-defense. She laughed. The sound filled the kitchen effortlessly. Dinner unfolded exactly as it had hundreds of times before. Daniel grilled salmon. Claire prepared roasted vegetables. Sophie described college applications. They joked, laughed, discussed books, debated movies, planned Christmas. Anyone watching through the dining room window would have seen the perfect American family. Kind, respectful, comfortable, the kind neighbors admired. After dinner, Sophie pulled out her phone. A family picture. Daniel groaned dramatically. Again? Absolutely. They stood together beside the Christmas tree. Sophie squeezed herself between her parents. Closer. Daniel instinctively stepped nearer. Claire smiled politely, but remained exactly where she stood. Not noticeably. Just enough. The camera clicked. Perfect. Another photograph for social media. Another memory that looked exactly right. Later that night, Sophie left to study at a friend's house. Daniel loaded the dishwasher while Claire wiped the kitchen counters. Neither spoke much. Not because anything was wrong. Silence simply fit them now. Daniel glanced toward her. You tired? A little. You've been volunteering a lot lately. I like being useful. You've always been useful. She nodded. Good night, Daniel. She walked upstairs. Daniel watched her disappear. Something about those two words caught his attention. Good night, Daniel. Not, good night, honey. Not, love you. Not, see you upstairs. Just his name. Simple, respectful, distant. He couldn't remember exactly when she had stopped using every nickname she'd once had for him. Maybe years ago. Maybe gradually enough that he never noticed. Upstairs, Claire changed into pajamas before standing before the bedroom mirror. The woman staring back looked composed, successful, healthy, strong. She also looked older than 40. Not because of wrinkles, because grief ages. People in places mirrors cannot show. She removed her wedding ring and placed it carefully into the small ceramic dish beside her bed. Every night. Every single night. She put it back on each morning before leaving the house. No one knew. Not Daniel. Not Sophie. Not even her closest friends. It wasn't an act of anger. It was simply the only time each day she allowed herself to acknowledge a truth she had buried beneath routine. She climbed into bed. Moments later, Daniel entered quietly. He smiled. Long day? She nodded. It was good. He switched off the bedside lamp. Darkness settled over the room. Between them lay barely 18 inches of mattress. Between their hearts, something much farther. Neither reached across the space. Neither expected the other to. Outside, snow continued falling over Maple Hollow, blanketing roads, rooftops and gardens in untouched white. From a distance, the town looked flawless. Peaceful, whole, beautiful. But anyone who had lived through enough winters knew the truth. Fresh snow has a remarkable way of covering cracks without ever repairing them. And sometimes, the prettiest landscapes hide the deepest fractures beneath the surface. There had been a time when silence meant something entirely different. Back then, it wasn't heavy. It wasn't a wall. It wasn't punishment. It was comfort. The kind of silence that exists between two people who don't feel the need to fill every moment with words because simply being together is enough. 18 years earlier, long before the careful distance, long before separate emotional lives under the same roof, long before every touch became a memory. Daniel Mercer first met Claire Brooks on a rainy Thursday afternoon in Burlington, Vermont. She wasn't looking for love. Neither was he. Daniel had stopped at a neighborhood coffee shop after spending the morning interviewing for his first teaching position. Fresh out of graduate school, 24 years old, he wore a wrinkled navy suit that suddenly seemed far too formal for a cafe filled with college students typing on laptops. Claire was 22, finishing her nursing degree while working part-time behind the coffee counter. She noticed him before he noticed her. Not because he was especially handsome, but because he looked completely lost. When it was finally his turn to order, he stared at the menu board as if it were written in another language. Claire smiled. First time here? Daniel laughed nervously. Is it that obvious? You've been studying the menu for almost 3 minutes. I was hoping something would suddenly make sense. She folded her arms across the counter. Tell me what kind of coffee you usually drink. I don't, she blinked. You came into a coffee shop. Because they also sell muffins. For a second, Claire simply stared at him. Then she burst into laughter. Not the polite laugh customers usually earned. A real one. Bright, unrestrained. The kind that made everyone nearby smile without knowing why. Daniel laughed too. I suppose that sounded ridiculous. A little. What would you recommend for someone who doesn't actually like coffee? Claire thought for a moment. Vanilla latte. Will it make me pretend I'm sophisticated? No. It won't. It'll just make you less tired. I'll take one. And a blueberry muffin? Please. As she prepared his drink, Daniel noticed how she moved. Unhurried. Focused. Every gesture seemed intentional. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply cared about doing ordinary things well. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed for the briefest moment. Neither pulled away too quickly. Good luck with your interview, Claire said. Daniel looked surprised. I never mentioned an interview. You've got a resume sticking out of your briefcase. He looked down. Sure enough, half a page peeked out. I guess you're observant. She smiled. I just pay attention. Those 4 words would stay with him for years. Over the following months, Daniel found reasons to return to that cafe. Sometimes after work. Sometimes before class. Sometimes for no reason at all. He still ordered the same vanilla latte. Claire teased him constantly. You know, real Vermonters drink black coffee. I'm working my way up. At this pace, you'll be 80 before you order one. I've got time. Eventually, they stopped pretending he was only there for coffee. One evening, after Claire finished her shift, Daniel asked if she'd like to walk along the waterfront. Lake Champlain shimmered beneath a pink-orange sunset. The air smelled faintly of pine and fresh rain. They talked for nearly 3 hours, not about grand ambitions, not about impressing each other, about books, favorite childhood memories, embarrassing moments, family traditions, dream vacations, the best pie in Vermont. And somehow, the conversation never felt forced. When Claire laughed, she tilted her head back slightly. When Daniel listened, he gave people his full attention. Neither realized they were quietly becoming each other's safest place. Their relationship grew slowly. Neither rushed. Neither played games. Daniel admired how compassionate Claire was. She volunteered at homeless shelters, remembered patients' birthdays, sent handwritten thank you notes. Claire admired Daniel's patience. He could spend 20 minutes helping a child understand a homework problem without once sounding frustrated. One snowy evening, they sat inside Daniel's tiny apartment, eating takeout Chinese food from paper cartons. The heating system had stopped working again. Both wore winter coats indoors. Claire looked around the cramped apartment. I've seen bigger closets. Daniel laughed. I prefer to call it efficient. You mean tiny? That too. She smiled before growing thoughtful. You know what's funny? What? If someone walked in here right now, they'd probably call the landlord. She laughed. No. She looked around again. They'd think we were rich. Daniel frowned. We're definitely not rich. I didn't say money. She reached across the small table. This time she took his hand. I mean this. Daniel looked down at their fingers intertwined. You make ordinary days feel important. For a moment, he couldn't speak. No one had ever described him that way. He squeezed her hand gently. I feel the same. A year later, Daniel proposed. Nothing extravagant. No flash mob. No expensive restaurant. Just the two of them hiking to the top of Mount Philo on a crisp September afternoon. The leaves had just begun turning shades of crimson and gold. They stood overlooking miles of forests and farmland. Daniel pulled a small velvet box from his backpack. Immediately, Claire covered her face. Oh my goodness. I haven't even asked yet. I know. She laughed through happy tears. I just know. Daniel took a deep breath. Claire Brooks. His voice shook. I don't have much. She interrupted. I know. I'll probably never make a fortune teaching history. I know. I'll make mistakes. I know. I'll forget anniversaries. She raised an eyebrow. You'd better not. He laughed. Okay. Maybe not anniversaries. Then his smile softened. But I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make you feel loved. Claire's eyes filled with tears. You already do. He opened the ring box. Will you marry me? She didn't hesitate. Yes. The word echoed across the overlook. Simple, certain, joyful. Their first years of marriage weren't easy. Money was tight. Daniel accepted his first teaching job in Maple Hollow. Claire found work as a pediatric nurse at the local hospital. They bought an old farmhouse that creaked every time the wind blew. The roof leaked during spring storms. The furnace had a personality of its own. The kitchen cabinets refused to close properly. But they loved it. Every Saturday became a home improvement project. Daniel painted walls crookedly. Claire laughed while fixing his mistakes. One afternoon they tried installing bookshelves together. The shelves leaned noticeably to the left. Daniel stared at them. "I think they're artistic." Claire laughed so hard she nearly dropped the hammer. "They're crooked. They have character." "They're crooked. They're characterfully crooked." She kissed him. "I married a stubborn man. You married an optimistic man." "Same thing." That house echoed with laughter. Sometimes they danced while making dinner. Sometimes they argued over whose turn it was to shovel snow. Sometimes they sat on the front porch saying absolutely nothing while watching fireflies blink across the summer fields. Back then, silence still meant peace. 2 years later, Sophie was born. Daniel cried before Claire did. The nurse smiled. "Dad usually tries to be the strong one." Daniel wiped his eyes. "I've never been this happy." Claire reached weakly for his hand. "We made her." "No." Daniel kissed Claire's forehead. "You did the hard part." They laughed together. From that day forward, every dream they had revolved around their daughter. They promised each other something in the hospital room that neither believed would ever be tested. "No matter what happens," Claire whispered, rocking baby Sophie in her arms, "let's never stop talking to each other." Daniel nodded without hesitation. Never. At the time, they believed communication would always come naturally. They had no idea that love isn't usually destroyed by one enormous argument. More often, it fades through conversations postponed, feelings buried, questions avoided, and truths left waiting until they become too heavy to carry. Years later, Daniel would remember that promise with painful clarity, because when the hardest conversation of their marriage finally arrived, neither of them would know how to begin, and silence would slowly become the third person living inside their home. Before we step into Chapter 2, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Daniel and Claire's marriage was already beginning to crack before the affair happened? Or do you believe one bad decision alone changed everything? Share your opinion in the comments below. I read them all, and I love seeing the different perspectives each of you brings to these stories. If this story is already pulling at your heart, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter. Trust me, what happened next didn't begin with betrayal. It began years earlier, with two people who loved each other deeply but slowly stopped saying the things that mattered most. Let's continue with Chapter 2. Before silence became the language of Daniel and Claire's marriage, it had been the language of their childhoods. Neither of them had chosen it. Like eye color or the sound of their laugh, it was something they inherited long before they understood its cost. Looking back years later, Daniel would realize something that history had taught him again and again. People rarely become who they are overnight. They become who they've been taught to be. Claire Brooks grew up in a modest brick house on the outskirts of Hartford, Connecticut. Her father, Harold Brooks, worked long shifts as a city bus driver. Her mother, Evelyn, taught 3rd grade at the neighborhood elementary school. They were good people, hard-working, responsible, faithful, but they had one habit that quietly shaped every corner of their home. They fought, not every day, not violently, not in ways that made headlines. Instead, they argued the way some people breathe, frequently, predictably, and always loud enough for everyone in the house to hear. Arguments over unpaid bills, over Harold working overtime, over forgotten anniversaries, over Evelyn spending too much time grading papers instead of resting, over whose family they would visit for Thanksgiving. Sometimes the arguments lasted 10 minutes. Sometimes they stretched through an entire weekend. The words eventually stopped. The tension didn't. 8-year-old Claire learned early that children weren't supposed to interrupt adults. So when voices rose downstairs, she quietly carried her favorite book into her bedroom, climbed onto the windowsill, and read until the shouting ended. Books became her refuge. Stories made more sense than people. Characters apologized. Problems found resolutions. Even heartbreak usually had a final chapter. Real life wasn't nearly as generous. One rainy Saturday afternoon, after listening to another argument through the heating vents, Claire wandered into the kitchen once the house had grown quiet. Her mother stood at the sink, washing dishes. Her father had already left for work. Without turning around, Evelyn asked softly, "Did we wake you?" Claire hesitated. "I wasn't asleep." Her mother stopped scrubbing the plate in her hands. "I'm sorry." Claire shrugged. "It's okay." Evelyn dried her hands and knelt beside her daughter. "No, sweetheart." She gently tucked a loose curl behind Claire's ear. It's not okay. Claire looked down at the floor. We don't mean to yell. I know. But sometimes adults don't know how to say they're hurting. Claire frowned. So they scream instead? Her mother's eyes filled with sadness. Sometimes. Claire thought about that answer for a long time. Finally she asked, what do I do when I'm hurting? Evelyn smiled sadly. You don't have to be loud to be strong. The advice came from love. But a child's mind often hears only half the lesson. Claire remembered. You don't have to be loud. She forgot the rest. As she grew older, Claire became known as the easy child. Teachers loved her. Neighbors praised her manners. She never caused trouble, never argued, never talked back, never complained. Adults called her mature. What they didn't see was that Claire had simply become an expert at swallowing disappointment before anyone noticed it. When classmates excluded her from birthday parties, she smiled. When she was overlooked for student council, she congratulated the winner. When her first boyfriend cancelled prom 2 days before the dance because he'd decided to go with someone else, she wished him well. Then she cried quietly in the bathroom after everyone had gone to bed. She never wanted to become the loudest person in the room. Because, in her mind, loud people hurt each other. Quiet people survived. Daniel Mercer grew up nearly 200 miles away in rural New Hampshire. His childhood looked different, but it taught him another version of emotional silence. His father, Thomas Mercer, owned a small auto repair shop. He believed in hard work, self-reliance, and solving problems with your hands instead of your words. Thomas wasn't cruel. He simply believed emotions were distractions. When Daniel fell off his bicycle at age 9 and scraped both knees bloody, his father helped him stand before saying, "You're okay." "I think my arm hurts." Thomas glanced at it briefly. "Can you move it?" Daniel nodded. "Then you're okay." No hug, no reassurance, no conversation about fear. Just move forward. Daniel adored his father. He wanted to be like him. Strong, reliable, calm under pressure. He began believing strength meant never letting people know when something hurt. His mother, Linda, was warmer. She hugged often, asked questions, encouraged feelings. But Thomas always had the final word. "If you spend your life talking about problems," he'd say over dinner, "you'll never get around to solving them." Daniel accepted that philosophy without questioning it. It sounded wise. It wasn't until much later that he understood something important. Some problems can't be solved until they're first spoken aloud. By high school, Daniel had developed a reputation for being dependable. He showed up, worked hard, helped classmates, kept promises. He was the friend everyone trusted with practical advice. But if someone asked how he was feeling, his answer never changed. "I'm fine." Even when he wasn't. Especially when he wasn't. Years later, after marrying Claire, their childhood lessons blended together in ways neither recognized. When Claire felt hurt, she grew quieter. When Daniel sensed distance, he worked harder instead of talking more. He fixed broken cabinets, changed the oil in Claire's car, cooked dinner, paid bills on time, believing actions alone could communicate love. Claire appreciated every gesture. She truly did. But appreciation isn't always the same as connection. Sometimes she wanted him to ask, "What's wrong?" Instead, he assumed she'd tell him if something mattered. She never did. Because she'd spent her entire life believing silence was kindness. Neither realized they were slowly building a marriage where both people loved deeply. Yet neither truly understood how the other processed pain. One Sunday afternoon, only a year after Sophie was born, they attended a neighborhood barbecue. Children ran through sprinklers, while adults gathered around picnic tables beneath towering maple trees. Daniel stood beside the grill talking football with neighbors. Claire sat under an umbrella, feeding Sophie mashed bananas. Across the yard, a young couple began arguing. Nothing dramatic, just the familiar frustration of exhausted new parents. The husband raised his voice. The wife folded her arms. Within minutes they apologized, hugged, and laughed awkwardly as everyone pretended not to notice. Claire watched quietly. Daniel returned carrying 2 lemonade glasses. "What happened?" She nodded toward the couple. "They had a fight. They seem okay now." Claire looked down at Sophie. "I could never do that." "What?" "Fight in front of people." Daniel smiled. "I don't think anyone enjoys it." "No." She shook her head. "I mean, I don't think I could ever let myself get that angry." Daniel kissed the top of Sophie's head. "That's one of the things I love about you." Claire smiled, but inside, something uneasy stirred. Because she wasn't calm. She was careful. There was a difference. She simply hadn't learned it yet. That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Claire stood in the nursery watching her daughter breathe. Daniel slipped an arm around her shoulders. Our little girl is growing fast. Claire nodded. I hope she grows up feeling safe. She will. I don't just mean physically. Daniel looked at her. I want her to know she can tell us anything. He smiled. We'll always listen. Claire leaned her head against his shoulder. I hope we're the kind of parents who make that easy. Neither of them knew then. Children often learn more from what parents model than from what parents promise. And somewhere in the years ahead, without intending to, they would teach Sophie that some of life's biggest hurts are endured in silence rather than spoken with love. That lesson would one day come back to challenge all three of them. For the first 5 years of their marriage, Daniel and Claire believed they had figured life out. Not because everything went according to plan. It didn't. But because every obstacle seemed temporary. When money was tight, they laughed about it. When the old farmhouse leaked during spring rainstorms, they placed buckets under the ceiling and joked that the house had indoor waterfalls. When Sophie refused to sleep through the night, they took turns walking the hallway with her until sunrise, surviving on coffee and determination. Life wasn't easy. It was simply shared. Neither imagined that the greatest threat to their marriage wouldn't arrive all at once. It would arrive quietly, one unnoticed day at a time. As Sophie entered kindergarten, life became busier than either of them expected. Daniel's reputation at Maple Hollow High School continued to grow. Parents requested him. Students transferred into his history classes whenever possible. The principal often asked him to mentor younger teachers. It felt rewarding. It also meant longer hours. There were lesson plans to revise, after-school tutoring sessions, faculty meetings, and weekend grading that somehow followed him home. His briefcase became a permanent fixture on the dining room table. Claire never complained. Instead, she'd clear a corner of the table each evening so they could still eat dinner together. Sometimes she'd place a sticky note on top of his stack of papers. Don't forget to eat. Love you. Daniel always smiled when he found them. Sometimes he even tucked the notes into his wallet. But increasingly, instead of sitting down beside Claire after dinner, he'd say, "Give me 30 minutes to finish grading." 30 minutes became an hour. An hour became 2. Eventually, Claire stopped waiting awake. She'd kiss Sophie's forehead, lock the back door, and go upstairs alone. Daniel always came to bed later, exhausted. He would whisper, "Sorry." Claire, already half asleep, would murmur, "It's okay." The words became routine. Too routine. Claire's world wasn't slowing down either. The pediatric unit at Maple Hollow Children's Hospital was busier than ever. Flu season filled every room. New nurses came and went. Parents leaned on her because she had a way of making frightening situations feel manageable. One evening, after a particularly difficult shift, Claire arrived home emotionally drained. A 6-year-old leukemia patient she'd cared for over 2 years had passed away that afternoon. She stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, staring at the groceries she'd forgotten to unpack. Daniel walked in carrying his briefcase. Hey, you okay?" She forced a smile. "Long day." He nodded sympathetically. "I know the feeling." Then he looked at the clock. "I've got to finish tomorrow's presentation." He disappeared into his office. Claire remained standing in the kitchen. She hadn't wanted him to fix anything. She simply wanted someone to ask about the little boy whose favorite dinosaur was a triceratops. She wanted someone to know she'd cried in the hospital supply closet before driving home. Instead, she unpacked the groceries. Alone. Months passed. Then years. Their love remained. But the conversations slowly changed. Once, they had talked about dreams. Now they talked about schedules. Who's picking up Sophie? Did you pay the electric bill? We need milk. Your mother called. Parent-teacher conference is Thursday. Useful conversations. Necessary conversations. But somewhere between calendars and grocery lists, the deeper ones disappeared. Neither noticed exactly when. One Friday evening, Daniel found Claire sitting on the front porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunset paint the Vermont hills in shades of orange and purple. He carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "I figured coffee this late would keep you awake." She accepted the mug. Good thinking. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence. At least Daniel believed it was comfortable. Claire was wondering whether she remembered the last meaningful conversation they'd had. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Beautiful evening." "It is. We should do this more often." "We've said that before." He smiled sheepishly. "Yeah." Silence returned. A flock of geese flew overhead. Claire watched them disappear beyond the trees. "I miss you." The words escaped so quietly, Daniel almost didn't hear them. He turned toward her. "But I'm right here." Claire smiled faintly. "I know." Daniel took that as reassurance. He reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'll try to be home earlier next week." "I'd like that." She meant it. He meant it. But next week came with another faculty meeting, then another school event, then another reason. Not because Daniel loved his work more than his wife, because he genuinely believed he was working hard for his family. He never realized that providing isn't the same as being emotionally present. That spring, Maple Hollow High hired several new teachers. Among them was Emily Carter, a 32-year-old English teacher who had recently transferred from Boston after her divorce. Emily was bright, confident, and naturally outgoing. She had an easy way of making people feel included. Within weeks she knew everyone's names. She organized staff lunches, remembered birthdays, left encouraging notes in colleagues' mailboxes. To Daniel, she was simply another teacher. Friendly, professional, nothing more. One afternoon she stopped by his classroom after school. "I heard you're the history wizard around here." Daniel laughed. "I've been called worse." She held up a stack of lesson plans. "I'm teaching To Kill a Mockingbird next month." "Great novel. I was wondering if you'd be interested in doing a joint lesson on the historical context." Daniel considered it. "That actually sounds fun." Emily grinned. "I knew you'd say yes." They spent the next hour discussing lesson ideas. When Daniel finally looked at the clock, he frowned. "I promised Claire I'd be home by 6. Emily gathered her papers. "You should go." As Daniel hurried out, he felt a flicker of guilt. Nothing serious. Just disappointment in himself. Again, he had stayed later than he intended. At home, Claire glanced at the kitchen clock. 6:15. Then 6:30. She texted, "Everything okay?" Daniel replied almost immediately. "Sorry, lost track of time planning a lesson. On my way." She believed him, because it was true. Still, something about waiting alone at a table set for 3 left a quiet ache she couldn't explain. When Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, Sophie ran to hug him. "Dad, you're late." He kissed the top of her head. "I know, Peanut. I'm sorry." Claire smiled as she placed dinner on the table. "It's getting cold. I'll warm it up." "No," she said gently. "Sit down." The meal was pleasant, normal, but Daniel noticed Claire spoke less than usual. "Everything okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Just tired." He accepted the answer. After all, she'd said those words dozens of times before. He had no idea this time they weren't entirely true. Over the next several months, Daniel and Emily worked together on several school projects. Nothing inappropriate, nothing secretive, nothing that would concern an outside observer. But something subtle began happening. Emily asked Daniel how his day was. She noticed when he looked stressed. She complimented his teaching. She laughed at his terrible history jokes. She listened. Daniel never compared her to Claire. He loved his wife deeply. Yet without realizing it, he found himself sharing little frustrations at work with Emily that he no longer shared at home. Not because Claire wouldn't listen, because he had slowly forgotten how to begin those conversations. Emotional distance rarely starts with betrayal. More often, it begins with harmless omissions, conversations delayed, feelings redirected, tiny choices that seem insignificant until they quietly lead somewhere neither person ever intended to go. And standing at that invisible crossroads, Daniel Mercer still believed he was miles away from making the worst decision of his life. He wasn't. Winter gave way to spring almost overnight in Maple Hollow. The snow melted into narrow streams that wound through the fields, carrying away months of frozen stillness. Maple trees sprouted fresh green leaves, front porches filled with flower pots again, and children rode bicycles until the streetlights flickered on each evening. Life looked as though it was beginning again. For Daniel Mercer, however, something invisible had already begun to unravel. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly, like a single loose thread on a sweater that no one notices until the entire sleeve begins to come apart. On Monday mornings, Daniel and Claire still shared coffee before leaving for work. It had been their ritual for years. Claire always woke first. She ground fresh coffee beans while the morning news played softly in the background. Daniel would wander into the kitchen 10 minutes later, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, kissing Sophie's forehead as she hurried through breakfast before school. The routine hadn't changed, but routines can sometimes hide the slow disappearance of intimacy. That morning, Claire slid Daniel's mug across the kitchen island. "Big day?" He nodded. "Faculty meeting after school." She smiled politely. "You've had a lot of those lately." "I know," he sighed. "End-of-year planning." Claire nodded. "I understand." She meant it. She truly did. Teaching wasn't a job that ended when the final bell rang. She respected that. But respect couldn't replace presence. Daniel reached for his briefcase. "I'll try not to be late." Claire looked at him for a second longer than usual. "You've been saying that a lot." The words weren't sharp. They weren't even critical. They were simply true. Daniel felt them anyway. I know. He stepped closer and kissed her forehead. I'll make it up to you this weekend. Claire smiled. You don't have to make anything up. She watched him leave through the front door. Then she whispered to herself, I just want you home. Daniel did intend to come home early, every time. But life had a way of rearranging good intentions. That afternoon, the faculty meeting ended 30 minutes late. As teachers gathered their notebooks and coffee mugs, Emily Carter caught up with him in the hallway. Got a minute? Daniel checked his watch. I probably shouldn't. It'll only take 5. She held up a stack of essays. I've got 3 students who quoted historical events completely wrong in their literature papers. Daniel laughed. That's almost impressive. I figured you might help me untangle the mess. He hesitated. 5 minutes wouldn't hurt. They walked back to her classroom. The conversation drifted from lesson plans to students, then to education, then to why each of them had become teachers in the first place. Emily leaned back against her desk. You know what I like about you? Daniel looked surprised. I wasn't aware this was an interview. She laughed. You actually care. Most teachers care. Not like you. He shrugged, uncomfortable. I'm just doing my job. No. She shook her head. You still believe one conversation can change a kid's life? Daniel looked away. My high school history teacher changed mine. So you're paying it forward? I guess. Emily smiled. The world needs more people like that. Daniel didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not spoken so directly. When Daniel finally arrived home, it was after 7. The dinner dishes had already been washed. Sophie sat at the dining room table finishing homework. Claire folded laundry in the living room. I'm sorry, Daniel said the moment he stepped inside. Claire looked up. It's okay. Meeting ran long. She smiled gently. I figured. No interrogation, no suspicion, no argument. Just understanding. Daniel almost wished she'd been angry. Anger would have forced a conversation. Instead, the evening slipped quietly back into its usual rhythm. Weeks turned into months. The collaboration between Daniel and Emily continued. They developed an after-school history and literature program together. Students loved it. Parents praised it. The principal called it one of the school's best new initiatives. Daniel genuinely enjoyed the work. He also enjoyed how easy it was to talk to Emily. She asked questions. She listened. She remembered details. One afternoon she handed him his favorite blueberry muffin. Daniel looked confused. You remembered? You mentioned once it reminds you of your grandmother. He smiled. I forgot I told you that. Emily shrugged. I pay attention. The words caught him off guard. Years earlier, Claire had said those exact same words. For a fleeting second, something inside him stirred. Not attraction. Recognition. The feeling of being deeply noticed. He pushed the thought away. At home, Claire noticed different things. Not perfume. Not lipstick. Not mysterious phone calls. Nothing that dramatic. She noticed Daniel laughed at text messages more often. She noticed he seemed distracted during dinner. She noticed he occasionally answered work emails after midnight. She noticed how often the name Emily came up in casual conversation. Emily thought the students would enjoy a debate. Emily found a great documentary. Emily suggested a new reading assignment. Each sentence sounded perfectly innocent. Because it was. Still, something in Claire's heart shifted ever so slightly. She couldn't explain why. She didn't want to. Trust meant refusing to invent problems where none existed. So she dismissed the feeling. One Saturday morning, Claire found Daniel repairing the old porch swing. The wooden seat had cracked after another harsh Vermont winter. She carried 2 glasses of lemonade outside. You don't have to fix everything yourself. Daniel tightened another bolt. I like fixing things. She smiled. I know. He looked up. Besides, this swing has history. Claire laughed softly. It certainly does. It had been the place where they'd shared countless conversations during their early years together. Dreams, plans, fears, laughter, even pregnancy announcements. Daniel tested the repaired swing. There. Claire sat beside him. For a few peaceful moments, they watched Sophie chase butterflies across the backyard. Then Claire asked quietly, Can I ask you something? Of course. Are you happy? Daniel answered without thinking. Yeah. She waited. He didn't elaborate. She nodded. I'm glad. But inside, she wondered why his answer had sounded so automatic, as though he'd answered the question before actually considering it. At school, Daniel's friendship with Emily remained comfortably professional, or so he believed. One rainy afternoon, the rest of the faculty left early because of severe weather warnings. Daniel stayed behind grading essays. Emily knocked gently on his classroom door. You heading home soon? In a minute. She looked out the window. I'd wait. Why? The roads are flooding. Daniel walked over beside her. Rain hammered the parking lot so hard it blurred the outlines of parked cars. Lightning flashed across the sky. Emily smiled. I've got leftover chili in the teacher's lounge. Daniel chuckled. Are you bribing me with food? I'm saving you from hydroplaning. He hesitated. The storm really was bad. Okay. They spent an hour eating paper bowls of chili while waiting for the weather to calm. They talked about books, movies, childhood memories. Nothing inappropriate, nothing secretive. Yet, something subtle happened. Daniel realized he hadn't laughed this freely in months. When he finally drove home, guilt settled quietly in his chest. Not because he'd done anything wrong. Because, for 1 hour, he'd forgotten to think about going home. Claire was already asleep when he arrived. He stood in the bedroom doorway watching her. The soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminated her face. She looked peaceful. He remembered the promise he'd made on their wedding day. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make you feel loved. When was the last time he'd actually asked her how she was doing? Not whether dinner was ready, not whether the bills were paid, not whether Sophie had finished her homework. How was she? He couldn't remember. Daniel quietly changed into pajamas and slipped into bed. Claire stirred slightly but didn't wake. He almost reached for her hand. Almost. Instead, he lay staring at the ceiling until long after midnight. Outside, rain continued falling across Maple Hollow. Inside, the distance between husband and wife remained small enough to cross with one conversation. Neither of them knew that soon. It would become much harder, because betrayal rarely begins in a hotel room. It begins the moment someone starts finding emotional comfort somewhere they should never have needed to look. People often imagine betrayal as something sudden, a reckless decision, a moment of overwhelming passion that appears without warning. Daniel Mercer would spend years wishing that had been true, because if the affair had begun with one terrible choice, perhaps one apology could have ended it. But the truth was harder to admit. The affair began long before there was ever another woman. It began the day he stopped bringing his loneliness home. The school year came to a close with its usual whirlwind of exams, graduation rehearsals, faculty meetings, and end-of-year celebrations. Every teacher looked exhausted. Daniel, especially. He was named Teacher of the Year, an honor voted on by both students and faculty. The auditorium erupted into applause as the principal handed him a plaque. Daniel smiled modestly. Thank you, he said into the microphone. No teacher succeeds alone. He thanked his students. He thanked the administration. He thanked his fellow teachers. He even thanked Emily for helping launch the history and literature program. When he finished speaking, everyone stood. Claire, sitting beside Sophie in the audience, clapped until her hands hurt. She couldn't have been prouder. On the drive home, Sophie couldn't stop talking. Dad, everyone loves you. Daniel laughed. They were just being nice. They gave you a standing ovation. Claire reached across the center console and squeezed his arm. You earned it. Daniel smiled. For a brief moment, everything felt exactly the way it used to. He wished he could freeze that evening forever. Summer arrived with longer days and warmer evenings. Claire picked up extra shifts at the hospital after 2 nurses went on maternity leave. Daniel spent part of his vacation helping redesign the school's history curriculum. Emily volunteered too. It'll only take a few weeks, Daniel had told Claire. She smiled. You've never really taken vacations anyway. He kissed her forehead. I'll make time. I know you will. She believed him. The curriculum meetings soon became lunch discussions. Lunch discussions became afternoon planning sessions. Afternoon planning sessions occasionally stretched into dinner at the diner across from the school. Always talking about work. Always convincing themselves there was nothing unusual about it. One afternoon, after finishing another planning session, Emily looked unusually distracted. You okay? Daniel asked. She stared out the classroom window. Today's my anniversary. Daniel frowned. I thought you were divorced. I am. She gave a quiet laugh. Doesn't stop the date from showing up every year. I'm sorry. Emily shrugged. We were married 11 years. Daniel didn't know what to say. I still remember the sound of the front door closing when he left. Silence settled between them. Finally she asked, have you ever wondered how people stop loving each other? Daniel answered slowly, I don't think most people do. No? I think they stop paying attention. Emily looked at him thoughtfully. You really believe that? I do, she smiled sadly. Then Claire's lucky. The compliment should have made him think about going home. Instead, it made him wonder whether he had been paying enough attention to his own marriage. That question stayed with him, not because Emily planted doubt, because she unknowingly uncovered doubt that already existed. Daniel loved Claire. He never questioned that. But he couldn't remember the last uninterrupted evening they'd spent together. Life had become schedules, responsibilities, parenting, work. He told himself it was just a season. Every married couple went through busy years. Things would slow down eventually, wouldn't they? One Friday evening, the school hosted a fundraising gala. Teachers, parents, local business owners, and school board members filled the community center with laughter and music. Claire couldn't attend. A flu outbreak at the hospital had left them critically understaffed. She kissed Daniel goodbye before leaving for work. "Have fun. I'd rather you were coming." "I know." She adjusted his tie. "You'll charm everyone anyway." He smiled. "I'll be home before you." She laughed. That's a first. Neither realized how much those ordinary words would haunt them. The gala lasted longer than expected. People lingered. The principal kept introducing Daniel to donors. Emily handled much of the event planning, and by 10 o'clock she looked exhausted. As the last guests departed, she dropped into a folding chair. "I think my feet have officially resigned." Daniel laughed. "You survived." "Barely." They helped stack chairs and clear tables. By the time they finished, only a handful of volunteers remained. Rain had begun falling outside. Hard. The kind of summer storm that turned parking lots into mirrors. Emily checked her phone. "My apartment building just lost power." Daniel glanced toward the window. "The roads aren't great either." She sighed. "I'll wait a while." The custodian approached them. "I'm locking up in 15. Daniel looked at Emily. "There's a 24-hour diner 2 blocks away." She smiled tiredly. "Coffee?" "Coffee." The diner was nearly empty. A waitress with silver hair poured them fresh coffee before disappearing into the kitchen. For a while they simply sat listening to rain drum against the windows. Then Emily asked quietly, "Can I ask you something personal?" Daniel hesitated. "Sure. When's the last time you and Claire went on a real date?" He searched his memory. "I don't know." Emily nodded, as though she'd expected that answer. "My marriage didn't end because of one affair." Daniel looked up. "What happened?" "It ended because we slowly became strangers who happened to share a mortgage." Her voice remained calm. "No fighting?" "Oh, we argued." She smiled without humor. "But the worst part wasn't the arguments." "What was?" "The silence after we stopped arguing." Daniel stared into his coffee. He thought about Claire, about the porch swing, about the unanswered question. "Are you happy?" He hadn't even asked her why she'd asked. When the rain finally eased, Daniel stood. "I should get home." Emily smiled. "You should." As they stepped into the parking lot, she slipped slightly on the wet pavement. Without thinking, Daniel caught her arm. For a second, neither moved, neither spoke. The moment lasted no more than a heartbeat, but something shifted. Emily looked into his eyes. "So this is how mistakes happen." Daniel let go immediately. His heart pounded. "We should go." She nodded. "Yes." They walked to their cars without another word. Daniel gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He drove home in complete silence. He expected the feeling to disappear by morning. It didn't. Instead, he avoided Emily at school for several days. He convinced himself distance would solve everything. It almost did, until the district education conference in Burlington. The conference lasted 2 days. Teachers from across Vermont attended workshops, seminars, and networking events. Daniel and Emily were assigned to present their curriculum project together. Their presentation was a success. The audience applauded. Colleagues congratulated them. That evening, conference organizers hosted a reception at the hotel. Daniel intended to stay 30 minutes. He stayed nearly 3 hours. People drifted from table to table. Conversations blended together. When the reception finally ended, he and Emily lingered in the hotel lobby discussing education, then life, then regrets. Neither remembered exactly who stopped talking first, only that the silence between them suddenly felt dangerous. Emily looked away. "This is a bad idea." Daniel nodded. "It is. You love your wife." "I do." She swallowed hard. "I don't want to become the reason someone else's marriage breaks." Daniel should have walked away then. He wanted to. Every decent part of him screamed to leave. Instead, he remained standing there, trapped between the man he had always believed himself to be and the man he was becoming. One impulsive moment followed. A kiss. Brief. Immediate. Wrong. The second it ended, Daniel stepped back as if burned. His face drained of color. "Oh, goo." Emily covered her mouth. "What have we done?" Daniel couldn't answer. He had spent years teaching teenagers that every decision carries consequences. Now he had become the lesson. The affair itself lasted only a short time afterward. A handful of secret meetings fueled by confusion, shame, and emotional weakness rather than love. There was no romance. No future imagined together. Only two lonely adults making choices they would both regret. Then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, Daniel ended it. "I can't keep doing this," he told Emily, his voice shaking. She nodded through tears. "I know. I'm going to lose everything." Emily looked at him sadly. "No, Daniel." She paused. "I think you already have." Daniel walked away believing he had ended the worst mistake of his life. He didn't know the hardest part hadn't begun, because somewhere, quietly and patiently, the truth was already making its way toward Claire. Truth has a peculiar way of arriving. It rarely knocks. It slips quietly into ordinary days, into receipts forgotten in a coat pocket, into a sentence that doesn't quite make sense, into a hesitation that lasts 1 second too long. And once truth enters a marriage, nothing ever looks quite the same again. 3 weeks after Daniel ended the affair, life appeared to return to normal. He came home earlier, cooked dinner more often, cancelled unnecessary meetings. He even surprised Claire one Friday evening with flowers from the little market downtown. She smiled when she opened the door. "They're beautiful. I saw them and thought of you." She accepted the bouquet. "Thank you." Daniel waited for the familiar warmth that usually followed moments like this. Instead, Claire simply carried the flowers into the kitchen, found a vase, filled it with water, and carefully arranged each stem. She appreciated the gesture, but appreciation and joy weren't the same thing. Daniel noticed the difference. He told himself she was simply tired. At the hospital, Claire's closest friend, Monica Hayes, had known her for nearly 8 years. Monica was the opposite of Claire in almost every way. She talked with her hands, laughed loudly, cried openly. If something bothered her, everyone knew within 5 minutes. One afternoon, they ate lunch together in the hospital cafeteria. Monica frowned. "You look exhausted." Claire smiled. "I've been busy." "No." Monica shook her head. "Busy doesn't make people look quiet." Claire looked down at her soup. "I'm fine." Monica leaned back. "You know I hate those 2 words." Claire laughed softly. "I know. You've been saying, 'I'm fine,' since I've known you. And somehow, you've never believed me. Because you're terrible at pretending." Claire changed the subject. "How's your son doing in baseball?" Monica sighed dramatically. "There you go again." "What?" "You build detours every time the conversation starts heading toward you." Claire stirred her soup. "I just don't have much to say." Monica studied her friend's face. She didn't push. She knew Claire well enough to understand that forcing conversations only made her retreat further. Still, something felt different. Something had changed. She simply couldn't identify it. Across town, Daniel found himself living with a constant, low hum of guilt. Not panic. Not fear of getting caught. Something heavier. He'd wake in the middle of the night watching Claire sleep, wondering how someone could lie simply by saying nothing. Every morning she smiled. Every morning she kissed Sophie's forehead before school. Every morning she asked Daniel if he'd remembered his lunch. The ordinary kindness almost hurt more than anger would have. He began writing letters he never intended to give her. One night, after Claire had gone upstairs, he sat alone at the kitchen table with a legal pad. He wrote, "Claire, there's something I've done that I don't deserve forgiveness for. Every time you smile at me, I feel like a thief stealing something that no longer belongs to me. I don't know how to tell you because I'm terrified that one sentence will destroy the life we've spent years building." He stopped, folded the paper, then tore it into tiny pieces. Not because the words weren't true, because he convinced himself confessing would only hurt her. If the affair was over, if it would never happen again, wasn't protecting her the kinder choice? That lie comforted him for exactly 12 minutes. The truth found Claire on a Tuesday, not through a dramatic confrontation, not because someone confessed, not because a stranger exposed them, because of a receipt. Daniel had asked Claire to grab a folder from the glove compartment of his car before she drove it to the mechanic. She opened the compartment. Inside were registration papers, insurance documents, a pack of gum, and a crumpled receipt from a hotel in Burlington. She almost ignored it, until she noticed the date. It matched the week of the education conference. The receipt showed 1 room, 2 breakfasts. Claire frowned. Maybe it was a billing error. She folded the receipt and placed it in her purse. She didn't jump to conclusions. Daniel deserved that much. That evening she asked casually over dinner, "How was the hotel in Burlington?" Daniel looked up. "It was fine." "Nice restaurant?" "Yeah." "They served breakfast?" He nodded while taking another bite. "It was included." Claire smiled gently. "Must have been generous." Daniel looked confused. What do you mean? 2 breakfasts. For the first time in years, Claire watched uncertainty cross her husband's face. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but she saw it. Daniel began. There were probably extra vouchers. Claire nodded pleasantly. Probably. She changed the subject. Sophie continued chatting about school. Dinner ended peacefully. No one raised their voice. No one argued. But Daniel barely tasted another bite. That night, he searched his briefcase, his wallet, his desk drawer. The hotel receipt was gone. His stomach dropped. He looked toward the bedroom upstairs. Claire was reading, exactly as she always did before bed. Calm, quiet, unchanged. He considered confessing, several times. Each time, fear stopped him. What if she'd never noticed? What if he'd only make everything worse? He hated himself for thinking it. Claire noticed more things over the next several days. Not because she was investigating. Because once a question enters your mind, ordinary details begin arranging themselves differently. Daniel's conference photos never included evenings. Emily's name disappeared from his stories almost overnight. He became unusually attentive, bringing flowers, helping with laundry, suggesting family outings. The kindness wasn't fake. If anything, it felt desperate. Claire began wondering why. One Friday afternoon she visited Maple Hollow High to drop off Sophie's forgotten science project. The front office secretary smiled warmly. Claire Daniels in the library. I'll surprise him. She walked through the quiet hallway. As she approached the library, she heard voices. The door stood slightly open. Inside, Daniel wasn't there. Only Emily. She was packing books into a cardboard box. Another teacher stood beside her. I heard you requested a transfer, the teacher said. Emily nodded. It's for the best. You'll miss Daniel. Claire froze. The teacher smiled knowingly. You two made a great team. Emily's expression changed. Not romantic, not guilty, simply sad. I think we've already said everything we needed to say. Claire stepped away before either woman noticed her. She quietly left the science project at the front office instead. On the drive home, her hands tightened around the steering wheel. Not because she'd discovered an affair, because she felt the shape of one. Still, she needed certainty. Claire had lived her entire life believing accusations without proof could destroy innocent people. She refused to become that person. The certainty arrived 4 days later. It came in the form of an envelope mistakenly delivered to Daniel's school mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note from Emily. Not a love letter. Not an attempt to continue the affair. A goodbye. Daniel found it after classes ended. His hands trembled as he read. You were right to end it. What happened between us should never have happened. I hope one day your wife knows the man you became afterward, instead of the man you were with me. Take care of your family. Emily. Daniel folded the note immediately. But he wasn't alone. Standing at the end of the hallway, holding the science project she'd forgotten to leave earlier that week, was Claire. Their eyes met. Neither moved. Neither spoke. The hallway suddenly felt impossibly long. Daniel looked at the letter in his hand, then back at his wife. He didn't need to explain. She had already understood. Claire's face remained astonishingly calm. No tears, no shouting, no questions. She simply looked at him for several seconds that felt like an eternity. Then she quietly turned around and walked away. Daniel called after her. Claire. She never looked back. For the first time since their wedding day, he realized silence could sound louder than any scream. Daniel reached the parking lot just as Claire started the car. Claire! His voice echoed across the nearly empty faculty parking lot. She didn't accelerate. She didn't drive away. She simply rested both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield. Daniel stopped beside the driver's side window, breathing hard. Please. Claire slowly lowered the window. The cool October air slipped between them. Neither spoke for several seconds. Daniel still held Emily's folded letter in his trembling hand. I can explain. Claire looked at the letter, then at him. Her face revealed almost nothing. Not because she felt nothing, because every feeling inside her had suddenly become too large for words. Finally, she asked one quiet question. Did you love her? Daniel answered before fear could interfere. No. The truth came instantly. Claire searched his eyes. Did you sleep with her? His shoulders sagged. A single tear escaped before he managed to whisper, yes. Silence. The wind carried a handful of yellow maple leaves across the parking lot. Claire closed her eyes, not to stop herself from crying, to steady herself. When she opened them again, they looked strangely peaceful. I see. Daniel took a desperate step forward. It ended. I know. I ended it. I know. I made the biggest mistake of my life. I know. Every answer came without anger, without accusation, without raising her voice. Daniel had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways. None of them looked like this. He would have preferred shouting. He would have preferred tears. He would have preferred anything that allowed him to believe this pain might someday explode and disappear. Instead, Claire's calmness frightened him, because it felt permanent. She started the car. "Claire, please." She finally looked directly at him. "You should go home." Then she drove away. Daniel arrived home nearly 40 minutes later. The house was unusually quiet. Sophie was spending the night at a friend's birthday party. Claire sat alone at the kitchen table. A mug of untouched tea rested in front of her. Daniel entered slowly. "I don't deserve for you to listen." "Ow." She looked up. "No. But please let me tell you everything." Claire nodded once. "Sit." He did. For nearly an hour, Daniel confessed. Everything. The emotional closeness. The conference. The kiss. The affair. Ending it. His shame. His guilt. His fear. He answered every question before she asked it, because she asked almost none. When he finished, the clock above the stove ticked loudly through the silence. Finally, Claire spoke. "How long?" 6 weeks. She nodded. "Were there others?" "No." "Will there ever be another?" "No." He answered with absolute certainty. Claire believed him. Oddly, that made everything worse, because she realized the affair hadn't happened because Daniel was a serial liar. It had happened because good people were still capable of terrible decisions. That truth was harder to process. Daniel leaned forward. "I'll quit my job." Claire looked surprised. "If that's what you need." "I'll transfer schools." "If that's what you need." "I'll tell everyone." She shook her head gently. "No. I'll do anything." "I know." He reached across the table. "I love you." Claire looked at his outstretched hand, then quietly stood. "I'm going to bed." "Claire." She paused at the doorway. Without turning around, she said, "I believe you love me." Daniel closed his eyes. Hope flickered inside him. Then she continued, "I just don't know what your love means anymore." She walked upstairs. Daniel remained at the kitchen table until sunrise. The next morning looked almost ordinary. Claire made breakfast, packed Sophie's lunch, asked Daniel whether he'd remembered his medication for his seasonal allergies. The routine continued, almost perfectly. Sophie never noticed anything unusual. She kissed both parents goodbye before catching the school bus. The front door closed. The house fell silent. Daniel found Claire washing dishes. "I'm not going to work today." She nodded. "I called the hospital." "I'll stay too." She didn't respond. Instead, she continued washing the same plate a little longer than necessary. Finally, she turned off the faucet. "There are some things I need to say." Daniel nodded. "I'm listening." Claire took a deep breath. "When I was little, Sue." She looked out the kitchen window. "My parents screamed every time they were hurt." Daniel remained silent. "I promised myself I'd never build a marriage like that." A tear finally escaped down her cheek. "So I'm not going to scream." Daniel's own tears came freely now. "I'm so sorry." She nodded. "I know." He hated those two words. They sounded like forgiveness. They weren't. Claire continued. "I'm not leaving." Daniel stared at her. "What?" "I'm staying." He blinked. "Why?" She looked around the kitchen, around the home they had built, the photographs on the walls, Sophie's artwork taped to the refrigerator, the life they'd created. "Because one terrible decision doesn't erase every good year we've lived." Daniel covered his mouth. Relief flooded him, until she spoke again. "But there is something you need to understand." He lowered his hands. "The woman who trusted you completely." She placed one hand gently over her own heart. "Doesn't live here anymore." Daniel felt the room tilt. Claire's voice never rose above a whisper. "You didn't kill our marriage." She looked directly into his eyes. "You killed the part of me that felt safe inside it." Those words would stay with him for the next 18 years. That night, they prepared for bed as they always had. Daniel brushed his teeth. Claire folded tomorrow's clothes. The routine was familiar, comforting, painfully ordinary. Daniel climbed into bed first. Claire switched off the bedside lamp. Darkness filled the room. He reached instinctively toward her, not for sex, simply for her hand. Claire gently moved farther across the mattress, only a few inches. "Enough." Daniel froze. "I'm sorry," she answered softly. "I know." Minutes passed. Then Claire whispered into the darkness. "I won't leave." Daniel waited. But I don't think I can ever let you touch me again. He thought he'd misheard. What? She kept facing the window. I can't explain it. Her voice trembled for the first time. When I close my eyes. She swallowed hard. I don't know where your hands have been anymore. Daniel began crying quietly. Please don't say that. I have to. Silence returned. Outside, rain began falling against the roof. Inside, 2 people lay less than 2 feet apart, separated by a wound neither fully understood. Daniel assumed it would last days, maybe weeks, perhaps a few months. He believed patience, counseling, honesty, and time would slowly rebuild what had been broken. Claire wanted to believe that too. She truly did. Neither of them realized they had just crossed an invisible line. The next morning, she would still make him coffee. She would still ask about his day. She would still celebrate birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings, graduations, and every ordinary Tuesday in between. She would remain his wife. She would remain Sophie's mother. She would remain his closest companion. But from that night forward, she would never again reach for his hand in bed. Never again rest her head on his shoulder. Never again kiss him goodnight. Never again invite him into the quiet, sacred space where trust once lived. And what Daniel thought would be a temporary consequence would quietly become the next 18 years of their lives. People often say that time heals all wounds. Daniel Mercer stopped believing that after the first year. Time didn't heal what had happened. It simply taught them how to organize their lives around it. Like a family rearranging furniture after discovering a crack in the living room floor. No one repaired it. They just learned not to step there anymore. The first anniversary after the affair arrived on a warm June afternoon. 20 years of marriage. Daniel remembered how excited he had once been for anniversaries. He used to plan surprise dinners, weekend getaways, handwritten letters, flowers hidden in unexpected places. This year, he stood in the greeting card aisle of Maple Hollow Pharmacy for nearly 30 minutes. Every card felt dishonest. To my soulmate. Forever yours. Every day, I fall more in love with you. He couldn't bring himself to buy any of them. Eventually, he chose the simplest card he could find. Its front read only, "Thank you for staying." Inside, he wrote one sentence. "I will spend the rest of my life becoming someone worthy of the grace you've shown me." He read it 3 times before placing it inside the envelope. Even then, he wasn't sure grace was the right word. Claire hadn't offered forgiveness. She had simply refused to leave. Those weren't the same thing. That evening, Daniel cooked dinner himself. Grilled salmon, roasted potatoes, fresh asparagus, Claire's favorite lemon cake from the bakery downtown. When she walked into the dining room, she paused. "You remembered?" "I remember every anniversary." She smiled politely. "I know." Dinner was pleasant. They talked about Sophie, the bookstore, the hospital, neighbors, books, weather, everything except the one thing sitting between them like an invisible guest. After dessert, Daniel handed Claire the card. She opened it slowly, read every word, then folded it carefully. "Thank you." "That's all?" She looked at him kindly. "What else would you like me to say?" Daniel lowered his eyes. "I don't know." Claire stood. "I should finish tomorrow's schedule." She carried the card upstairs. Daniel never asked where she kept it. Years later, after Claire's mother passed away, he would discover every anniversary card stored neatly inside a cedar box in the closet. She had saved every single one. She simply hadn't known how to answer them. Daniel kept his promise. He changed schools, transferred to a district nearly 45 minutes away. He never contacted Emily again, never searched for her online, never asked mutual colleagues about her. As far as he knew, she moved back to Massachusetts. He hoped she found peace. Mostly, he hoped Claire would. He also began changing in smaller ways, not because Claire demanded it, because he could no longer ignore the man he had become. He started leaving work exactly at 4 o'clock every afternoon. No excuses, no extra meetings, no unnecessary committees. At first, his new principal questioned it. "You've always volunteered." Daniel smiled. "I'm volunteering at home now." He attended every one of Sophie's soccer games, every piano recital, every science fair. He fixed broken fences, cooked breakfast on Saturdays, learned how to braid Sophie's hair after Claire laughed through 3 hilariously crooked attempts. He became the husband he should have been all along. The tragedy was, he became him too late. Claire noticed every change. She noticed when he started putting his phone away during dinner. She noticed when he asked about her day and actually listened without checking emails. She noticed when he remembered the names of the children she talked about from the hospital. She noticed the handwritten notes he quietly slipped into her lunch bag. She noticed all of it. She appreciated all of it. She trusted none of it completely. Not because she believed he was pretending, because betrayal permanently changes the way memory works. Every beautiful moment now carried an invisible question. Is this who you always were? Or who you became after hurting me? Claire hated that question. It wasn't fair to Daniel. It wasn't fair to herself either. But once trust breaks, the mind begins protecting itself from future surprises. 3 years passed, then 5. The routine settled into something almost peaceful. Almost. Every morning began the same way. Claire woke first. Coffee, breakfast, a kiss on Sophie's forehead, a smile toward Daniel. Morning. Morning. Every evening ended the same way. Dinner, conversation, television, reading, bed, good night. Nothing dramatic, nothing cold, nothing overtly hostile. Visitors admired their marriage. Neighbors often commented, "I hope my marriage looks like yours after 20 years. Daniel would smile politely. Claire would thank them. Neither corrected the illusion. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning the garage, Daniel found an old cardboard box labeled honeymoon. Curious, he carried it inside. Claire looked up from the couch. "What's that?" "I think we packed it years ago." Together, they opened it. Inside were photographs, postcards, restaurant menus, a seashell from Cape Cod, a faded amusement park ticket. Sophie, now 11, bounced into the room. "Ooh. Baby pictures." Daniel laughed. "Not quite." She grabbed one photo. "You guys were cute." Claire smiled genuinely. Daniel had his arm wrapped tightly around her waist. Claire's head rested comfortably against his shoulder. Another picture showed them dancing barefoot on a beach. Another captured them kissing beneath fireworks. Sophie looked back and forth between the photographs and her parents. "You don't take pictures like this anymore." The room fell strangely quiet. Daniel searched for an answer. "We're older now." Sophie shrugged. "So?" Claire gently placed another photograph back into the box. "People change." Sophie frowned. "But you still love each other, right?" Daniel answered immediately. "More than anything." Claire looked at him. Then, at Sophie. "Of course we do." It wasn't a lie. It simply wasn't the whole truth. Love had remained. Trust had not. That evening, Sophie taped one honeymoon picture onto the refrigerator. The one where Daniel and Claire were laughing at something only they understood. Claire noticed it the next morning while pouring coffee. She stared at the younger version of herself for several seconds. The woman in the picture looked free. She barely recognized her. Daniel entered the kitchen moments later. He saw the photograph too. "She picked a good one." Claire nodded. "Yes." Daniel stepped beside her. "I miss that." Claire continued staring at the picture. "So do I." He almost reached for her hand. Almost. Instead, he wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. The opportunity disappeared, just like thousands of others over the years. Because silence had become so familiar, neither of them knew how to interrupt it anymore. That autumn, Maple Hollow hosted its annual Harvest Festival. Families filled Main Street. Children painted pumpkins. Local musicians performed beneath strings of hanging lights. Claire and Daniel volunteered at the bookstore's reading booth, while Sophie wandered through the festival with friends. An elderly couple approached, carrying matching caramel apples. The husband, who had to be in his late 70s, absent-mindedly reached over and brushed a strand of silver hair away from his wife's face. She smiled without even looking at him. It was clearly a habit built over decades. Small, natural, almost invisible. Claire watched them disappear into the crowd. Daniel had seen it too. Neither mentioned it. Neither needed to. Some gestures don't create longing because they're extraordinary. They create longing because they once felt ordinary. And somewhere deep inside both of them, they quietly mourned a marriage that was still alive, yet no longer knew how to touch. Children don't always understand what they see, but they almost always notice it. Not all at once. Not because someone tells them, simply because they grow up inside the rhythm of a home. They remember who laughs first, who apologizes first, who sits beside whom during movie nights, who reaches for whose hand while crossing the street. And sometimes, they notice the things that never happen. By the time Sophie Mercer turned 14, she had become one of those teenagers who seemed older than her years. She inherited Claire's patience, Daniel's curiosity. She loved books, played the piano beautifully, and carried a notebook everywhere she went, filling it with observations about people she met. Claire often joked that Sophie noticed details the way other people noticed colors. She rarely missed anything. One Saturday morning, while helping her mother organize old family photo albums, Sophie paused over a picture from years earlier. It showed Daniel twirling Claire around the kitchen while flour covered both of them. "Mom?" Claire looked up from another album. Yes? Were you and Dad always this affectionate? Claire smiled faintly. We used to dance a lot. Sophie studied another photograph. You used to kiss in pictures too. Claire's fingers hesitated over the page she was turning. We were younger. Sophie looked thoughtful. I don't think I've ever seen you kiss. Claire forced a gentle smile. People change. Sophie wasn't convinced. But Grandma and Grandpa still kiss. Claire laughed softly. They embarrass each other on purpose. They're adorable. They are. Sophie closed the album. I hope whoever I marry still wants to hold my hand when they're old. Claire's smile lingered, but her heart tightened, because once upon a time, she had hoped for exactly the same thing. That evening, Daniel found Sophie sitting on the back porch swing reading. The swings still leaned slightly to the left, despite all the repairs he'd made over the years. He sat beside her. What are you reading? Little Women. He smiled. Classic choice. She nodded. After a few minutes, she closed the book. Dad? Can I ask you something? Always. She looked out across the backyard before speaking. Do marriages change when people get older? Daniel considered the question. They do. How? They become quieter. Sophie frowned. Is that a good thing? Sometimes. But not always. He sighed. No. She turned toward him. Do you still love Mom? Daniel didn't hesitate. With everything I have. Then why don't you ever show it? The question landed harder than any accusation ever could. Daniel looked toward the house where Claire stood washing dishes through the kitchen window. I try. Sophie shook her head gently. No. She wasn't being disrespectful, only honest. You do nice things. She smiled. You make breakfast. You fix everything. You never forget birthdays. But, she searched for the right words. You don't look at each other the way Grandma and Grandpa do. Daniel swallowed. What way is that? They look happy to be close. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Sophie whispered, I've always wondered if maybe that's just what marriage becomes. Daniel stared at his daughter. For the first time, he understood the true cost of 18 years without affection. It hadn't only changed him. It was teaching his daughter what love was supposed to look like. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Sophie's words echoed through his mind. I've always wondered if maybe that's just what marriage becomes. He quietly climbed out of bed and walked downstairs. The old farmhouse creaked beneath his footsteps. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen sink, looking out into the darkness. A few minutes later, he heard soft footsteps behind him. Claire. She wrapped a cardigan around herself. Couldn't sleep? He shook his head. No. She poured herself tea. Neither spoke. Eventually, Daniel broke the silence. Sophie asked me something tonight. Claire looked up. What? She asked if I still loved you. Claire's expression softened. What did you tell her? The truth. And? I told her, I love you with everything I have. Claire lowered her eyes into her tea. I'm glad. Daniel leaned against the counter. She also asked why we never show it. Claire remained quiet. After a long pause, she said, Children ask difficult questions. They deserve honest answers. Claire nodded slowly. They do. Daniel looked at her. Maybe we should tell her. Claire's head lifted immediately. Tell her what? The truth. No. The answer came gently, but firmly. Why not? Claire looked toward the family photographs lining the hallway. Because she deserves to remember her childhood as peaceful. It wasn't peaceful. She looked back at him. It wasn't violent either. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I don't want her growing up believing marriage feels like this. Claire whispered, I don't either. Then she quietly carried her tea upstairs, leaving Daniel alone once again. A few weeks later, Maple Hollow High hosted its annual father-daughter community dance. Sophie insisted Daniel attend. You can't say no. I wasn't planning to. Claire spent nearly an hour helping Sophie choose a dress. When Daniel saw his daughter coming downstairs that evening, he smiled proudly. You look beautiful. Sophie grinned. I know. Claire laughed. Confidence. I like it. At the community center, fathers danced awkwardly while daughters laughed at their lack of rhythm. Daniel and Sophie danced together twice. 3 times. Eventually, the band played a slow song. Across the room, dozens of married couples joined the dance floor. Older husbands rested hands gently against their wives' backs. Women leaned comfortably into familiar shoulders. Years of trust visible without a single word. Daniel watched them. Sophie noticed. Dad? Go ask Mom to dance. He blinked. She's not here. I know. She smiled mischievously. But next year? Daniel forced a smile. Maybe. No. She bumped his arm playfully. Definitely. Daniel laughed for her sake. But inside, his heart broke, because he couldn't imagine Claire saying yes. The following Sunday, Claire visited her parents in Connecticut. Harold had recently retired. Evelyn's arthritis had worsened, making gardening difficult. Claire spent the afternoon helping around the house. While washing dishes together, Evelyn glanced toward her daughter. Can I ask you something? Claire smiled. When have you ever needed permission? Her mother chuckled. Fair point. She dried another plate. You and Daniel okay? Claire's hands slowed. We're fine. Evelyn raised one eyebrow. You sound exactly like I used to. Claire looked away. What does that mean? When someone says they're fine instead of happy, I pay attention. Claire remained silent. Her mother gently placed a hand over hers. I spent years thinking silence protected my family. Claire felt tears threatening. I know. No. Evelyn shook her head sadly. I don't think you do. Claire finally looked at her. I taught you not to scream. You did. But I forgot to teach you something equally important. What? Evelyn squeezed her daughter's hand. Silence can become another kind of shouting. Claire stared at her mother. Those words followed her all the way back to Vermont. For the first time in 18 years, she wondered whether protecting everyone from conflict had also protected everyone from healing. The thought frightened her. Because if her mother was right, then the silence she had believed was preserving her family might actually be quietly breaking it. Children don't always understand what they see, but they almost always notice it. Not all at once. Not because someone tells them, simply because they grow up inside the rhythm of a home. They remember who laughs first, who apologizes first, who sits beside whom during movie nights, who reaches for whose hand while crossing the street. And sometimes, they notice the things that never happen. By the time Sophie Mercer turned 14, she had become one of those teenagers who seemed older than her years. She inherited Claire's patience, Daniel's curiosity. She loved books, played the piano beautifully, and carried a notebook everywhere she went, filling it with observations about people she met. Claire often joked that Sophie noticed details the way other people noticed colors. She rarely missed anything. One Saturday morning, while helping her mother organize old family photo albums, Sophie paused over a picture from years earlier. It showed Daniel twirling Claire around the kitchen, while flour covered both of them. Mom? Claire looked up from another album. Yes? Were you and Dad always this affectionate? Claire smiled faintly. We used to dance a lot. Sophie studied another photograph. You used to kiss in pictures too. Claire's fingers hesitated over the page she was turning. We were younger. Sophie looked thoughtful. I don't think I've ever seen you kiss. Claire forced a gentle smile. People change. Sophie wasn't convinced. But Grandma and Grandpa still kiss. Claire laughed softly. They embarrass each other on purpose. They're adorable. They are. Sophie closed the album. I hope whoever I marry still wants to hold my hand when they're old. Claire's smile lingered, but her heart tightened. Because once upon a time, she had hoped for exactly the same thing. That evening, Daniel found Sophie sitting on the back porch swing reading. The swing still leaned slightly to the left, despite all the repairs he'd made over the years. He sat beside her. What are you reading? Little Women. He smiled. Classic choice. She nodded. After a few minutes, she closed the book. Dad? Can I ask you something? Always. She looked out across the backyard before speaking. Do marriages change when people get older? Daniel considered the question. They do. How? They become quieter. Sophie frowned. Is that a good thing? Sometimes. But not always. He sighed. No. She turned toward him. Do you still love Mom? Daniel didn't hesitate. With everything I have. Then why don't you ever show it? The question landed harder than any accusation ever could. Daniel looked toward the house where Claire stood washing dishes through the kitchen window. I try. Sophie shook her head gently. No. She wasn't being disrespectful, only honest. You do nice things. She smiled. You make breakfast. You fix everything. You never forget birthdays. But... She searched for the right words. You don't look at each other the way Grandma and Grandpa do. Daniel swallowed. What way is that? They look happy to be close. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Sophie whispered, I've always wondered if maybe that's just what marriage becomes. Daniel stared at his daughter. For the first time, he understood the true cost of 18 years without affection. It hadn't only changed him. It was teaching his daughter what love was supposed to look like. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Sophie's words echoed through his mind. I've always wondered if maybe that's just what marriage becomes. He quietly climbed out of bed and walked downstairs. The old farmhouse creaked beneath his footsteps. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen sink, looking out into the darkness. A few minutes later, he heard soft footsteps behind him. Claire. She wrapped a cardigan around herself. Couldn't sleep? He shook his head. No. She poured herself tea. Neither spoke. Eventually, Daniel broke the silence. Sophie asked me something tonight. Claire looked up. What? She asked if I still loved you. Claire's expression softened. What did you tell her? The truth. And? I told her I love you with everything I have. Claire lowered her eyes into her tea. I'm glad. Daniel leaned against the counter. She also asked why we never show it. Claire remained quiet. After a long pause, she said, Children ask difficult questions. They deserve honest answers. Claire nodded slowly. They do. Daniel looked at her. Maybe we should tell her. Claire's head lifted immediately. Tell her what? The truth. No. The answer came gently, but firmly. Why not? Claire looked toward the family photographs lining the hallway. Because she deserves to remember her childhood as peaceful. It wasn't peaceful. She looked back at him. It wasn't violent either. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I don't want her growing up believing marriage feels like this. Claire whispered, I don't either. Then she quietly carried her tea upstairs, leaving Daniel alone once again. A few weeks later, Maple Hollow High hosted its annual father-daughter community dance. Sophie insisted Daniel attend. You can't say no. I wasn't planning to. Claire spent nearly an hour helping Sophie choose a dress. When Daniel saw his daughter coming downstairs that evening, he smiled proudly. You look beautiful. Sophie grinned. I know. Claire laughed. Confidence. I like it. At the community center, fathers danced awkwardly while daughters laughed at their lack of rhythm. Daniel and Sophie danced together twice. 3 times. Eventually, the band played a slow song. Across the room, dozens of married couples joined the dance floor. Older husbands rested hands gently against their wives' backs. Women leaned comfortably into familiar shoulders. Years of trust visible without a single word. Daniel watched them. Sophie noticed. Dad? Go ask Mom to dance. He blinked. She's not here. I know. She smiled mischievously. But next year. Daniel forced a smile. Maybe. No. She bumped his arm playfully. Definitely. Daniel laughed for her sake. But inside, his heart broke, because he couldn't imagine Claire saying yes. The following Sunday, Claire visited her parents in Connecticut. Harold had recently retired. Evelyn's arthritis had worsened, making gardening difficult. Claire spent the afternoon helping around the house. While washing dishes together, Evelyn glanced toward her daughter. Can I ask you something? Claire smiled. When have you ever needed permission? Her mother chuckled. Fair point. She dried another plate. You and Daniel okay? Claire's hands slowed. We're fine. Evelyn raised one eyebrow. You sound exactly like I used to. Claire looked away. What does that mean? When someone says they're fine instead of happy, I pay attention. Claire remained silent. Her mother gently placed a hand over hers. I spent years thinking silence protected my family. Claire felt tears threatening. I know. No. Evelyn shook her head sadly. I don't think you do. Claire finally looked at her. I taught you not to scream. You did. But I forgot to teach you something equally important. What? Evelyn squeezed her daughter's hand. Silence can become another kind of shouting. Claire stared at her mother. Those words followed her all the way back to Vermont. For the first time in 18 years, she wondered whether protecting everyone from conflict had also protected everyone from healing. The thought frightened her, because if her mother was right, then the silence she had believed was preserving her family might actually be quietly breaking it. Some apologies are spoken once, others are lived every day. Daniel Mercer stopped counting how many times he had said, I'm sorry, somewhere around the 3rd year after the affair. Not because he stopped meaning it, because he began to realize that repeating the words wasn't bringing Claire any closer. If anything, every apology reminded her of the night that had made one necessary. So, somewhere along the way, Daniel changed his approach. He stopped asking for forgiveness. He started trying to become the kind of man who no longer needed excuses. 8 years passed. The old farmhouse looked different now. The porch had been rebuilt. The leaking roof had finally been replaced. The kitchen cabinets no longer stuck. Daniel had remodeled them himself over 3 summers. Friends often complimented the house. It feels so warm in here. It feels loved. It feels peaceful. Daniel would smile politely. Claire would thank them. The house truly was peaceful. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, no cold wars. Just a quiet rhythm that had become second nature. It was the kind of peace people admired. Only Daniel and Claire knew how expensive it had been. Sophie was 16 now, tall, confident, preparing college applications. She had inherited Claire's calm spirit, but Daniel was relieved to notice she had also inherited something else. She wasn't afraid to ask difficult questions. She spoke her mind respectfully. She apologized when she was wrong. She laughed loudly. Sometimes Claire watched her daughter and wondered if this was what emotional courage looked like. It was beautiful. It was also unfamiliar. One evening, Daniel arrived home carrying a small paper bag from the local bakery. Claire looked up from the dining table. "You remembered?" "I always do." Inside the bag was a cinnamon roll. Not just any cinnamon roll. The exact kind Claire had loved since they were newlyweds. Years ago, she had once mentioned that her father bought one for her every birthday when she was little. Daniel had never forgotten. He placed it gently in front of her. "Happy birthday." Claire looked at it for several moments. Then she smiled. "Thank you." Sophie walked into the kitchen just then. "Dad, you still remember Mom's favorite?" Daniel laughed. "I'd be in trouble if I didn't." Claire looked at him. "No," she said softly. "You wouldn't." The words were simple, but Daniel heard what lay beneath them. Years ago, forgetting little things might have hurt Claire. Now, she expected nothing. Expectations had quietly disappeared from their marriage, and somehow, that realization hurt him more than disappointment ever could. A few weeks later, Daniel was grading papers when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Claire. "Leaving work early today." He smiled and replied, "Everything okay?" A minute later, "Just tired." Daniel stared at the message. Once upon a time, he would have accepted those words without another thought. Now he knew better. He called immediately. Claire answered on the 3rd ring. "Hi. You said you're tired." "I am. Is that all?" Silence, then a quiet laugh. "You've learned." Daniel smiled sadly. "I'm trying." Claire looked out the hospital parking lot before answering. "A little girl I cared for died this afternoon." Daniel closed his eyes. "I'm so sorry." "So am I. Do you want to talk?" Another pause. "I don't know. I can just listen." Claire leaned back in her seat. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then, for the first time in years, she told him about one of her patients, about the little girl's love of horses, about the stuffed rabbit she'd refused to sleep without, about the parents who had held each other's hands until the very end. Daniel never interrupted. He never offered advice. He simply listened. When Claire finally finished, she whispered, "Thank you." Daniel blinked. "For what?" "For not trying to fix it." After the call ended, Daniel sat quietly in his classroom. It wasn't a breakthrough. Claire hadn't suddenly become emotionally open, but for the first time in years, she had allowed him to witness her grief instead of carrying it alone. It felt like being trusted with something fragile. Encouraged, Daniel began making one small change after another. Instead of asking, "How was your day?" he asked, "What stayed with you today?" Instead of saying, "Everything will be okay," he learned to say, "That sounds really hard." Instead of solving problems, he began sharing them. One evening while repairing the fence, he admitted, "I've been worried about getting older." Claire looked surprised. "You have?" He nodded. "I think about retirement." She smiled faintly. "You?" "I know." He laughed. "I've always planned 10 years ahead." "What worries you?" Daniel leaned against the fence post. "I'm afraid I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for something I can never undo." Claire didn't answer immediately. Finally she said, "Maybe making up for it isn't the goal." He looked at her. "Then what is?" "Becoming someone who wouldn't make that choice today." Daniel stood quietly. He had never thought about it that way. That autumn, Sophie's guidance counselor invited parents to Career Inspiration Night. Families gathered in the high school auditorium while students interviewed adults about their professions. Sophie chose to interview Claire. "Mom, why did you become a nurse?" Claire smiled. "Because when I was little, I spent a lot of time in hospitals with my grandmother." "Were you scared?" "Very." "What made you feel safe?" Claire thought for a moment. "A nurse who sat beside me." "Did she say something special?" Claire smiled gently. "No." "What then?" "She stayed." The room grew quiet. Claire continued, "Sometimes people think helping means finding the perfect words." She shook her head. But I've learned that many people don't remember what you said. They remember that you didn't leave. Several parents nodded. Daniel felt tears prick his eyes. Because Claire had unknowingly described her own marriage. She had stayed, even when part of her wanted to run, even when trust had shattered. She stayed. Driving home, Sophie sat in the back seat. I loved what Mom said. So did I, Daniel admitted. Sophie smiled. I think people really do remember who stays. Daniel glanced toward Claire in the passenger seat. She looked out the window at the passing maple trees glowing red and gold beneath the setting sun. He wondered how many times she had chosen to stay when leaving might have been easier. Not just physically, emotionally. Every day she woke up and chose kindness over bitterness, responsibility over resentment, grace over revenge. He admired her deeply, perhaps more than ever before. Yet, admiration wasn't the same as closeness. He still couldn't reach across the space between them. Not because he no longer wanted to, because he no longer knew whether it was his place. The years had softened many things, his pride, his impatience, his need to defend himself. But they had not erased the invisible line Claire had drawn the night she discovered the affair. And though Daniel never crossed it again, he couldn't stop wondering whether it would remain there for the rest of their lives. Healing is rarely loud. It doesn't usually arrive with dramatic speeches or unforgettable moments. More often, it appears quietly, in a changed habit, a gentler response, or the courage to keep showing up, even when nothing seems to improve. Daniel Mercer had become a different man. Almost everyone who knew him could see it. The only question that still haunted him was whether the person whose opinion mattered most could ever truly feel it. It had been nearly 12 years since the affair. Daniel no longer measured time by anniversaries. He measured it by ordinary moments. 12 years since Claire had reached for his hand. 12 years since she'd leaned her head against his shoulder while watching a movie. 12 years since she'd kissed him goodnight. Not once had she broken the promise she had never intended to make. She had remained kind, faithful, present, but her body carried a boundary her heart had never been able to cross again. Daniel respected it, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. One Saturday morning, Maple Hollow Community Church organized a volunteer day to renovate the home of an elderly widow named Margaret Collins. Daniel immediately signed up. So did Claire. They spent the morning painting walls, repairing porch railings, and replacing broken windows. Margaret, 78 years old and as sharp as ever, watched everyone bustle around with grateful eyes. At lunchtime, she invited the volunteers to sit beneath the large oak tree in her backyard. She carried an old photograph in her hands. My husband built this porch, she said, smiling. Daniel looked at the picture. A young man stood beside Margaret, both of them laughing as they held paintbrushes covered in white paint. You look happy, Daniel said. Margaret chuckled. Oh, we weren't. The volunteers laughed. We argued all through that project. Claire looked surprised. You did? Margaret nodded. He wanted the porch blue. I wanted it white. So, who won? Someone asked. Margaret grinned. 48 years later, I honestly can't remember. Everyone laughed again. Then her smile softened. But I do remember something. She looked down at the photograph. Every night, no matter how angry we were, Harold reached for my hand before we fell asleep. Silence settled over the group. I don't remember every argument. She smiled sadly. But I remember never wondering whether we still belonged to each other. Daniel felt those words settle heavily inside him. Without meaning to, he glanced toward Claire. She was looking at the photograph too. Her expression revealed nothing. Yet he sensed she had heard every word just as deeply. Driving home, neither spoke for several miles. Finally, Daniel asked, Can I ask you something? Claire looked out at the passing countryside. You usually do. He smiled faintly. Do you ever think about before? She knew exactly what he meant. Sometimes. What do you remember? Claire was quiet for so long that Daniel assumed she wouldn't answer. Then she surprised him. I remember laughing more. He nodded. So do I. I remember feeling safe enough to fall asleep on your shoulder. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter. I miss that. Claire closed her eyes briefly. I do too. The admission hung between them. Not hopeful, not hopeless, simply honest. That evening, Sophie arrived home from a college tour with exciting news. I got accepted. Daniel nearly dropped the dish he was drying. You did? She laughed and threw her arms around him. State University. Claire hugged her tightly. I'm so proud of you. Dinner that night felt lighter than it had in years. They celebrated with pizza and homemade brownies. For several hours, the weight that usually lingered in the house seemed to lift. After Sophie went upstairs to call her friends, Daniel and Claire remained at the kitchen table. He smiled. We did a good job. Claire looked toward the staircase. We did. He hesitated. She turned out kind. And honest. And brave. Claire nodded. I think she's braver than we are. Daniel looked down. I think you're right. The following week, Daniel attended a mandatory professional development seminar on adolescent mental health. One speaker, a family therapist, made a statement that refused to leave his mind. She said, "Children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who show them how healthy repair happens after mistakes." Daniel wrote the sentence in large letters across the top of his notebook. Healthy repair. He realized something painful. Claire and he had protected Sophie from conflict so completely that they had also hidden reconciliation. She had never seen them argue. But she had also never seen them heal. She had grown up believing peace meant avoiding difficult conversations. The realization sat heavily with him. That evening, he shared the seminar with Claire. She listened carefully. When he repeated the therapist's words, Claire didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood and walked to the living room window. Snow had begun falling again. The first snowfall of the season. It makes sense, she said quietly. What does? I spent so many years trying to protect Sophie from pain. She paused. That I may have accidentally taught her to hide hers. Daniel looked at her. I don't think it's too late. Claire gave a small, uncertain smile. I hope you're right. A month later, Sophie's English class assigned students to write an essay titled, What Makes a Relationship Last? One evening, she sat at the dining room table typing furiously. Daniel walked past. Need a second opinion? She laughed. You'll probably grade it. I promise not to. She turned the laptop toward him. At the top of the page he read, The strongest relationships aren't the ones that never experience pain. They're the ones where both people feel safe enough to tell the truth before silence becomes a wall. Daniel froze. That's beautiful. Sophie smiled. I've been thinking about it a lot. Claire, who had been reading on the couch, looked up. Where did you get that idea? Sophie shrugged. I don't know. She smiled. I guess from watching people. Daniel's heart ached. She had no idea how close she had come to describing her parents. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Daniel found Claire sitting alone on the front porch. The repaired swing creaked gently beneath her. He carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Mind if I join you? She moved slightly to make room. For several minutes, they watched snowflakes drift beneath the porch light. Finally, Daniel spoke. I've spent 12 years hoping one day you'd trust me again. Claire wrapped both hands around her mug. I know. I don't expect everything back. She nodded. I know. I just... He searched for the right words. I wish I knew whether I'm still walking toward something, or simply walking in circles. Claire stared out into the snow-covered yard. When she finally answered, her voice was almost lost in the quiet night. I don't know either. It wasn't the answer Daniel wanted, but it was the most honest one she had given him in years. For the first time since the affair, neither of them pretended certainty they didn't possess. And, strangely, that fragile honesty felt like the smallest beginning of something neither had believed possible. Not forgiveness, not restoration, simply truth. Sometimes, after years of silence, truth is the first form of healing. Life has an uncanny way of bringing old wounds back into the light, not because it wants us to suffer again, but because some seasons refuse to let us move forward while pieces of our hearts remain trapped in the past. For Daniel and Claire, that season arrived on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. It arrived with a diamond ring. The Mercer family had gathered for lunch after church. The dining table overflowed with roast chicken, mashed potatoes, homemade biscuits, and Claire's famous apple pie. Daniel carved the chicken while Claire poured sweet tea into tall glasses. Sophie seemed unusually nervous. She barely touched her food. Daniel noticed first. You okay, Peanut? She smiled too quickly. I'm fine. Claire looked up immediately. You've been quiet all morning. Sophie exchanged a glance with someone standing just outside the dining room. Daniel frowned. Who's at the door? Before anyone answered, a young man stepped into the room carrying a bouquet of white lilies. Tall, clean-cut, with warm brown eyes and an awkward smile. Daniel recognized him instantly. Ethan Walker, Sophie's college sweetheart. The young man cleared his throat. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer. Claire smiled warmly. Come in, Ethan. He looked as nervous as Sophie. Daniel chuckled. Somebody tell me what's happening before I have a heart attack. Sophie stood. Tears already shimmered in her eyes. Dad. She held up her left hand. A simple diamond sparkled beneath the afternoon sunlight. We're engaged. Silence, not heavy, just stunned. Daniel stared at the ring, then at Ethan, then back at Sophie. His eyes filled before he could stop them. You, You. He laughed through tears. You're getting married? Sophie nodded. Yes. Daniel stood so quickly, his chair nearly tipped over. He wrapped his daughter in the tightest hug he'd given her since she was little. I'm so proud of you. Claire stood beside them, tears streaming freely. She embraced them both. Ethan smiled with obvious relief. I asked her father for permission yesterday. Daniel looked at him. You did? I wanted to do it the right way. Daniel walked over and hugged the young man. Welcome to the family. The following weeks became a whirlwind. Wedding magazines filled the living room. Guest lists covered the dining table. Cake tastings, dress appointments, venue tours. Everything revolved around Sophie's excitement. The old farmhouse came alive again. Laughter echoed through rooms that had known quiet for far too long. Daniel loved every minute. Watching Sophie prepare for marriage reminded him of the happiest season of his own life. Until one evening, Claire and Sophie sat together on the living room floor sorting through old family photographs for the wedding slideshow. Daniel carried in fresh popcorn. What are we looking at? Our history. Sophie smiled. She held up another honeymoon picture. Mum, look at the way Dad's looking at you. Claire accepted the photograph. Daniel was staring at her with complete adoration, the kind that existed before regret, before guilt, before silence. Sophie laughed. You two were ridiculously in love. Daniel smiled sadly. We were. Were? Sophie looked up. You mean are? Daniel quickly corrected himself. Yes. Claire quietly returned the picture to the pile. No one noticed. She placed it face down. A few days later, Sophie visited the wedding venue with both parents. It overlooked Lake Champlain, surrounded by maple trees that would be blazing red and gold by the time autumn arrived. The event coordinator led them through the ballroom. The first dance happens here. She pointed toward the polished wooden floor. Parents usually join after the bride and groom. Sophie clapped excitedly. Perfect. The coordinator smiled. You'll dance with your father first. Sophie nodded. And then, I want my parents to dance together. Daniel's heart skipped. Claire froze. It lasted less than a second. Only Daniel noticed. The coordinator continued discussing decorations completely unaware, but Daniel no longer heard a word. He was looking at Claire. She kept smiling politely, as if nothing had happened. That evening, after Sophie had gone upstairs, Daniel found Claire standing alone on the back porch. The summer air smelled of freshly cut grass. Fireflies blinked across the fields. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Daniel said, You don't have to do it. Claire kept watching the fireflies. What? The dance? She smiled faintly. I know. You looked uncomfortable. She turned toward him. I wasn't uncomfortable. What were you? She searched for the right word. Surprised? Daniel nodded. I was too. Silence settled between them. Finally Claire whispered, I don't know if I can. Daniel looked down. I understand. She reached out instinctively, then stopped herself halfway. Her hand slowly returned to her side. Daniel noticed. She noticed that he'd noticed. Neither acknowledged it. Some habits become so deeply rooted, they continue even after the heart begins questioning them. A week later, Sophie stopped by the bookstore after work. Claire was organizing new arrivals. Mom? Yes? I've been thinking. Claire smiled. That usually means trouble. Sophie laughed. Maybe. She leaned against the counter. I really want you and Dad to dance at my wedding. Claire's hands paused over a stack of novels. We'll see. No. Sophie shook her head gently. I mean, really dance. Claire looked confused. What do you mean? I've watched enough weddings to know the difference. Claire waited. Some couples dance because everyone expects them to. And others? They dance because they forget everyone else is in the room. Claire lowered her eyes. I don't know if your father and I. She stopped. Sophie studied her mother's face. Can I ask you something? Claire nodded. Have you and Dad ever stopped loving each other? The question lingered in the quiet bookstore. Claire answered honestly. No. Sophie frowned. Then why does it sometimes feel like you're both afraid of each other? Claire's breath caught. Not afraid. Careful. But perhaps. To a child who had grown into a perceptive young woman, carefulness looked very much like fear. Claire couldn't answer. Not because she didn't know, because she wasn't ready to say it aloud. That night she couldn't sleep. Long after Daniel's steady breathing filled the bedroom, Claire sat alone by the window. The moonlight spilled across the hardwood floor. She thought about Sophie's question. Have you ever stopped loving each other? The answer had always been no. Love had never disappeared. It had simply changed shape. It had become quieter, more responsible, less vulnerable, safer. But was safe always better? She wasn't sure anymore. For the first time in 18 years, Claire allowed herself to imagine something she had carefully avoided. What if staying wasn't the hardest part? What if learning how to live again was? Outside, the wind rustled the maple trees. Inside, a question she had buried for nearly 2 decades finally began asking to be heard. And once certain questions awaken, they refuse to fall asleep again. Some conversations don't begin with courage. They begin because there is no longer any place left to hide. For Daniel and Claire, that moment arrived 3 nights after Sophie's visit to the bookstore. It arrived without planning, without preparation, without either of them realizing that the silence they had protected for 18 years was finally beginning to crack. It was nearly 11 o'clock when the phone rang. Claire reached it first. "Hello?" Her expression softened. "Hi, sweetheart." Daniel looked up from the novel he had been pretending to read. "Sophie." Claire listened quietly for several minutes. She smiled once, then frowned. "What happened?" Another pause. "It's okay. Slow down." Daniel couldn't hear Sophie's words, only Claire's responses. "No, honey. No, that doesn't mean you're failing. Every engaged couple has disagreements." "Yes, I'll tell him." When Claire finally hung up, she remained standing beside the kitchen counter. Daniel waited. "What happened?" Claire looked tired. Sophie and Ethan had their first real fight. Daniel smiled slightly. "About the guest list." He laughed. "That sounds familiar." Claire couldn't help smiling. "We argued about ours too." "We certainly did." For a brief moment, they shared the same memory, the same smile. Then the silence returned. Daniel poured 2 cups of chamomile tea. He handed one to Claire. "How's she doing?" "She's upset." "Did they work it out?" "They apologized." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Good." Claire stirred her tea absent-mindedly. "She said something interesting." "What?" Claire looked directly at him. "She told me." She hesitated. That arguing scared her less than pretending nothing was wrong. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Claire continued quietly. "She said she'd rather have one difficult conversation than 10 years of guessing what someone feels." Neither spoke. The words settled heavily between them. Because both knew. Sophie hadn't learned that lesson from watching them. She had learned it despite watching them. Later that night, Daniel found himself standing on the back porch. The air was cool. Summer was beginning to surrender to autumn. Claire stepped outside a few minutes later. Neither seemed surprised to find the other awake. She wrapped a cardigan tighter around herself. "It's getting colder." Daniel nodded. "Yeah." For several minutes, they simply watched the stars. Then, almost without thinking, Daniel asked the question that had lived inside him for nearly 2 decades. "Claire." She looked toward him. "Why did you really stay?" She closed her eyes. Not because she hadn't expected the question. Because she had. For years. She just hadn't known when it would finally come. "I've asked myself that same question," she admitted. Daniel waited patiently. "I've answered it differently depending on the year." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Claire leaned against the porch railing. "The first year?" She smiled sadly. "I stayed because Sophie was little." Daniel nodded silently. "The 5th year?" "I stayed because I hoped I'd wake up one morning and realize the pain was gone." "The 10th year?" "I stayed because leaving after so many years suddenly felt harder than remaining." Daniel swallowed. "And now?" Claire looked out across the dark fields stretching beyond their property. "Now." Her voice almost disappeared. "I stay because you're my family." The words sounded strangely familiar. Daniel remembered hearing something very much like them in the bedroom only weeks earlier. "But," Claire continued, "family isn't always the same thing as intimacy." Daniel looked down at the wooden porch floor. "I've spent 18 years believing I was waiting for your forgiveness." Claire turned toward him. "I forgave you years ago." He looked up so quickly she almost smiled. "You, what?" "I forgave you." Daniel stared at her. "Then why?" His voice cracked. "Why couldn't you let me back in?" Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Because forgiveness and safety aren't the same thing." The sentence settled over them like the cool night air. "I stopped wishing bad things would happen to you. I stopped wanting to punish you. I stopped replaying the affair every day." She placed one hand gently against her chest. "But every time you touched me." She looked away. "My body remembered something my mind was trying to forget." Daniel felt tears running freely down his face. Claire wasn't accusing him. She was simply telling the truth. A truth she had protected him from for 18 years. I hated that. She laughed quietly through her tears. I hated it because it wasn't logical. I knew you weren't that man anymore. I knew you had changed. I watched you become a better father, a better husband, a better listener. I saw every single effort. She looked directly into his eyes, and somehow, my heart believed you. But my body never caught up. Daniel covered his face. He had imagined hundreds of explanations over the years. None had prepared him for this. I should have told you. Claire whispered. I know. I thought if I kept waiting. Now, one day, I'd wake up different. She laughed softly. I kept thinking healing was something that happened automatically. Daniel slowly shook his head. We both believed that. The porch grew quiet again, but this silence felt different, not avoidant, reflective. For the first time in years, neither of them was hiding. Daniel lowered his hands. Can I tell you something? Claire nodded. I stopped reaching for you a long time ago. Not because I stopped wanting to. He smiled sadly. I stopped because every time you moved away, I hated knowing I was asking something from you that hurt. Claire's eyes widened slightly. You noticed. Daniel laughed softly. Claire. I noticed everything. I noticed when you stopped wearing perfume to bed. I noticed you started sleeping closer to the window. I noticed you always folded the blankets between us before lying down. I noticed you stopped calling me Danny. Claire closed her eyes. I didn't realize. I know. I never wanted you to feel guilty. You already carried enough. A breeze rustled through the maple trees. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime sang softly. Claire looked toward the old porch swing. It still leans. Daniel smiled. I fixed that swing 4 times. It's stubborn. So are we. For the first time in 18 years, Claire laughed. Not politely, not carefully. A real laugh. It was brief, but it was real. Daniel hadn't heard that laugh in so long that it startled him. When the laughter faded, neither rushed to fill the quiet. Finally, Claire spoke. I don't know what happens next. Daniel nodded. Neither do I. I can't promise everything changes tomorrow. I'm not asking you to. I can't promise I'll suddenly become the woman I was before. Daniel looked at her gently. I don't want the woman from 18 years ago. She looked surprised. You don't? He slowly shook his head. I want the woman standing in front of me. The one who's finally telling me the truth. Claire felt something inside her loosen. Not disappear. Not heal completely. Simply loosen. Perhaps honesty didn't erase pain. Perhaps it simply gave pain somewhere safe to exist. As they stood together beneath the Vermont stars, neither reached for the other's hand. Neither felt ready. But for the first time since the night, everything changed. The distance between them no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a bridge they had finally begun building. From opposite sides, the hardest conversations don't always change people overnight. Sometimes, they simply give hope a place to breathe again. The morning after Daniel and Claire talked on the porch, nothing looked different. The coffee still brewed at 6:30. The newspaper still landed with a dull thud at the end of the driveway. The bookstore still opened at 9. Daniel still left for work carrying the same worn leather briefcase he'd owned for almost 15 years. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had changed. Inside the Mercer home, everything had. Not because the pain was gone, but because silence no longer held exclusive ownership of the marriage. Daniel resisted the temptation to ask the question that had haunted him for years. Are we okay now? He knew better. Healing wasn't a destination reached after one heartfelt conversation. It was a series of choices. Small ones, daily ones, sometimes invisible ones. So, instead of searching for reassurance, he chose patience. 3 evenings later, Claire walked into the kitchen carrying 2 bowls of homemade tomato soup. Daniel looked up from the crossword puzzle he was pretending to solve. I thought we could eat outside. He smiled. The porch? She nodded. It's supposed to rain later. For years they had eaten dinner at the dining table because it was practical. The porch had become little more than decoration. Tonight, Claire chose it. The change was almost too small to notice. Daniel noticed anyway. They sat side by side overlooking the backyard. Crickets sang beneath the fading light. The repaired porch swing creaked gently in the breeze. Neither rushed to speak. Eventually, Claire broke the silence. Do you remember the first meal we ate in this house? Daniel laughed immediately. The pizza? She smiled. It was terrible. It wasn't terrible. It absolutely was. The cheese slid completely off. And you dropped half of yours on the floor. Daniel laughed harder. I still ate it. You absolutely did. For several minutes, they laughed together. Not because the memory was extraordinary, because it belonged to a version of themselves they had almost forgotten still existed. Inside the house, Sophie paused halfway down the staircase. She had been about to ask whether anyone wanted dessert. Instead, she smiled quietly. She hadn't heard her parents laugh like that together in years. She didn't interrupt. Some moments deserved privacy. She simply walked back upstairs with a lighter heart. A week later, Claire received unexpected news. Monica, her longtime friend from the hospital, announced her retirement. The pediatric unit organized a small farewell celebration after work. Daniel surprised Claire by arriving with flowers. Not roses. Sunflowers. Her favorite. Monica laughed when she saw him. Well, look who's showing the rest of these husbands up. Daniel grinned. I figured 18 years of marriage means I should know her favorite flower. Monica looked at Claire. He remembered. Claire smiled warmly. He usually does. Monica leaned closer while Daniel spoke with another nurse. You know, she whispered, I still looks at you the same way. Claire blinked. What way? As if you're the most important person in every room. Claire instinctively glanced toward Daniel. He was laughing with one of the doctors. Then, almost as if sensing her eyes on him, he looked back. Their eyes met across the room. For the first time in years, neither immediately looked away. It lasted only seconds. Yet something gentle passed between them. Recognition. Not romance. Not yet. Recognition. Monica noticed. A small smile appeared on her face. That Saturday, Daniel found an old cardboard box while cleaning the attic. Written across the top in Claire's handwriting were 3 words. Do not throw away. Curiosity got the better of him. He carried it downstairs. Claire looked up from the couch. You found it. What is it? She walked over slowly. Our letters. Daniel frowned. What letters? The ones we wrote before we got married. His eyes widened. I thought those disappeared. So did I. Together, they opened the box. Inside were dozens of envelopes, tied together with faded blue ribbon. Daniel picked one up. The date read, March 14th, 1993. He carefully unfolded the paper. Dear Claire. His younger handwriting leaned awkwardly across the page. I know we're only 200 miles apart while you're finishing nursing school, but somehow it feels like 2,000. I miss hearing you laugh. I miss our walks by the lake. Mostly, I miss talking to you about absolutely nothing. Daniel stopped reading. His throat tightened. Claire quietly opened one of her own letters. Dear Danny. She smiled at the nickname. She hadn't written it in almost 2 decades. Promise me something. She continued silently until tears gathered in her eyes. Daniel looked concerned. What is it? She handed him the page. Near the bottom she had written, If we ever stop talking honestly, promise we'll be brave enough to find each other again. Daniel stared at the sentence. His vision blurred. I forgot this. Claire whispered. So did I. They spent the next 2 hours reading old letters aloud. Some were funny, some embarrassingly romantic. Some described dreams that had long since come true. Others spoke about fears that now seemed almost innocent. One letter made them both laugh, until tears streamed down their faces. Daniel had confidently predicted that by age 40 he would have mastered grilling steak. Claire looked at him. You still burn it. I maintain the grill is defective. The grill has survived 3 replacements. It's clearly contagious. She laughed again. The sound filled the living room. This time, it lasted longer. As evening settled over Maple Hollow, Claire gathered the letters back into the box. She held one envelope in her hands a little longer than the others. Daniel noticed. What is it? She looked down. This was the last letter you wrote before our wedding. Do you remember what it says? She nodded slowly. I memorized it. Daniel looked surprised. You did? She smiled sadly. I used to read it every anniversary. He blinked. Even after? She nodded. Especially after. Daniel couldn't understand. If it hurt so much, why keep reading it? Claire looked at him with quiet honesty. Because I needed to remember that the man who betrayed me wasn't the whole story. She placed the letter gently back into the box. I never wanted one terrible chapter to erase every beautiful page before it. Daniel felt tears gathering again. For 18 years, he had believed Claire remembered him only through the lens of his worst mistake. Now he discovered something remarkable. She had spent those same years fighting to remember the man she had fallen in love with. Perhaps that was why she had stayed. Not because she had forgotten the betrayal, but because she refused to let it become the only truth about their life together. And for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't approaching its ending. Perhaps it was finally learning how to begin again. Some truths arrive too late to change the past, but they can still change the future. Daniel didn't realize how much that old box of letters had awakened inside both of them until the following Tuesday. He came home, expecting another ordinary evening. Instead, he found Claire sitting alone in the living room, with one of the letters resting in her lap. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling. She was simply remembering. Daniel hesitated in the doorway. "Am I interrupting?" Claire looked up. "No." He walked in slowly. "I didn't know you kept reading them. I stopped for a few years." She gently folded the letter. "Then I started again." "Why?" Claire rested the envelope on the coffee table. "Because I was afraid." "Of what?" She looked directly at him. "That one day I'd only remember the affair." Daniel lowered himself into the armchair across from her. "I thought that's exactly what happened." She shook her head. "No. I remembered everything. The good, the bad, the beginning, the ending, the promises, the betrayal." Her voice remained calm. "I carried all of it." Daniel looked around the familiar room. The bookshelf he had built, the fireplace they had decorated every Christmas, the piano Sophie had practiced on for years. Everything around them held a memory. Some joyful, some painful. "I've spent 18 years believing I destroyed everything." Claire thought about that. "You broke something precious." She chose her words carefully. "But you didn't destroy everything." Daniel looked surprised. "I didn't?" "No." She smiled faintly. "If you had." She looked around the room. "We wouldn't still recognize each other." The words stayed with him. Recognize each other. How many marriages survived only because two people continued recognizing the goodness beneath the pain? That weekend, Sophie invited both parents to meet her and Ethan for lunch in Burlington. Wedding plans had become more detailed. The guest list was finalized. The menu selected. Flowers ordered. Only one thing remained unresolved. The parent dance. As soon as everyone sat down, Sophie pulled out a notebook. "Okay?" She smiled excitedly. "We're almost finished." Ethan laughed. "She has color-coded tabs. They're necessary." Daniel chuckled. "I believe you." Sophie flipped through several pages. "Cake. Done. Music. Done. Photography. Done." She stopped. "The family dances." The table grew noticeably quieter. Claire reached for her water. Sophie looked between both parents. "I've been thinking." Daniel waited. "I don't want anything fake." Claire looked up. "What do you mean?" "I don't want you two dancing because everyone expects it." She smiled softly. "If you'd rather not." "I'd rather no." Daniel looked at Claire. Claire looked at Daniel. Neither answered immediately. Finally Claire spoke. "We're still thinking about it." Sophie nodded. "That's enough." No pressure. No guilt. Just honesty. As they left the restaurant, Ethan quietly walked beside Daniel. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "My parents divorced when I was 12. Daniel nodded. "I'm sorry." "They hated each other." He smiled sadly. "I used to think staying together was always better." He glanced towards Sophie and Claire walking ahead. "Now I'm not sure." Daniel remained silent. Ethan continued. "I think what's better is whatever allows people to be honest." Those words stayed with Daniel for the rest of the drive home. A few days later, Daniel received an unexpected email from his former principal. The school was celebrating its 100th anniversary. Former teachers were invited to attend. Daniel stared at the invitation for several minutes. Maple Hollow High, the place where everything had changed. Claire found him standing in the kitchen. "You've been looking at that screen for 5 minutes." He smiled weakly. "It's an anniversary celebration." "For the school?" He nodded. "They invited former teachers." Claire understood immediately. "Emily might be there." "I don't know." Silence. Daniel closed the laptop. "I'm not going." Claire surprised him. "Why not?" He looked confused. "I don't need to reopen old wounds." Claire leaned against the counter. "Daniel, you've spent 18 years running from one mistake." He looked at her carefully. "I'm not running." "I think you are." He frowned. "I don't miss her." "I know. I don't love her." "I know. I don't want anything to do with that part of my life." Claire nodded gently. "I know. Then why go back?" Claire smiled sadly. "Because maybe it's time you stopped believing your worst day deserves to define every day after it." Daniel stared at her. She had never spoken like this before. You really believe that? I wouldn't still be here if I didn't. Daniel attended the anniversary alone. The school looked almost exactly the same. Fresh paint, new lockers, updated classrooms, but the hallways still echoed the same way. Old colleagues greeted him warmly. Former students shook his hand. Several thanked him for believing in them. One man in his 30s smiled broadly. Mr. Mercer. Daniel searched his face. You probably don't remember me. I'm terrible with names. Ryan Mitchell. Daniel's eyes widened. The Civil War debate team. Ryan laughed. You told me one sentence I'll never forget. Daniel searched his memory. Ryan smiled. You said, your worst mistake should become your greatest teacher, not your permanent identity. Daniel felt completely still. He had spoken those words years before the affair, long before he needed them himself. Ryan continued. I almost dropped out of college. I remembered what you said. It changed my life. Daniel thanked him quietly. As Ryan walked away, Daniel realized something astonishing. For years, he had refused to extend himself the same grace he had spent a lifetime teaching others. When he returned home that evening, Claire was waiting on the porch. How was it? Daniel sat beside her. I learned something. She smiled. What? I've spent years trying to punish myself. Claire nodded. I know. I thought guilt proved I loved you. She looked toward the sunset. Guilt proves you have a conscience. He looked at her. But it doesn't heal anyone. No. It just keeps everyone trapped. Daniel leaned back against the porch swing. I think I finally understand. Claire waited. You stayed. You forgave me. But neither of us knew how to stop living inside that one night. Claire whispered. No. We didn't. The evening air grew cooler. A flock of birds crossed the orange sky overhead. Daniel watched them disappear beyond the hills. Can I ask one more question? Claire nodded. If you could go back. To the day you found out. Would you still stay? Claire didn't answer immediately. She thought about 18 birthdays, 18 Christmas mornings, Sophie's graduation, family vacations, quiet dinners, hospital visits, funerals, laughter, tears, the ordinary life they'd continued building. Finally she answered, I would still stay. Daniel closed his eyes. Relief washed over him. Then she added softly, but I wouldn't stay silent. He opened his eyes again. Claire smiled through tears. I thought silence would protect all of us. She shook her head. It protected the wound, not the marriage. Daniel reached toward her instinctively, then stopped. Claire noticed, without saying a word. She slowly closed the distance between them. Not much, only enough that their shoulders gently touched. For the first time in 18 years, neither of them moved away. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't the ending of their pain. It was something quieter. Two people choosing not to let silence sit between them anymore. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with a simple decision to stop creating distance where none is needed. Real healing rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It doesn't erase old memories overnight. And it certainly doesn't make 18 years of pain disappear because of one honest conversation. Instead, healing often begins with something much smaller. A different question. A longer pause. A sentence someone would have been too afraid to say yesterday. For Daniel and Claire Mercer, healing didn't begin when Claire forgave him. It began when they both stopped pretending silence was the same as peace. Autumn settled gently over Vermont. The maple trees surrounding their farmhouse exploded into brilliant shades of crimson, amber, and gold. Tourists drove for miles just to admire the changing leaves. Daniel had always loved autumn. Claire used to tease him that he loved history because everything old fascinated him. He used to answer, old things remind us that beautiful things survive. Now, standing on the porch with a rake in his hands, he wondered if marriages could survive the same way. Not by pretending nothing had happened, but by choosing, every day, to care for what remained. One Saturday morning, Daniel stepped into the kitchen to find Claire writing in a small leather notebook. She closed it gently when he entered. He smiled. Secret journal? Claire laughed. I've had this notebook for years. I've never seen it. You've never asked. He blinked. She wasn't criticizing him. She was simply stating a fact. Daniel poured himself coffee. What's in it? Claire looked at the notebook. Things I never said. He looked at her with quiet curiosity. Would you ever let me read it? She thought for a long moment. Not yet. Daniel nodded. I understand. Years ago, he might have asked again, or felt rejected. Now he simply accepted that trust grows at its own pace. Claire noticed. She smiled almost imperceptibly. "You've become patient." Daniel shrugged. "I spent too many years trying to rush what only time could build." Later that afternoon, they drove to Sophie's apartment to help assemble furniture she and Ethan had ordered for their future home. Boxes filled the living room. Instructions looked more like puzzles than directions. Within 20 minutes, Daniel had accidentally attached one bookshelf backward. Ethan stared at it. "I don't think that's right." Daniel folded the instruction manual. "I was testing your attention to detail." Sophie laughed so hard she nearly dropped a screwdriver. "Nice recovery, Dad." Claire covered her mouth, trying unsuccessfully to hide her laughter. Daniel looked at his wife. "There it is." "What?" "That laugh." Claire tilted her head. "What about it?" "I've missed it." The room grew quiet. Claire looked away for a second before answering softly. "I've missed hearing it too." Neither forced the moment. Neither tried to make it bigger than it was. Sometimes, acknowledging joy is enough. As they worked, Ethan watched Daniel and Claire with quiet interest. Later, while carrying empty boxes to the recycling bin, he walked beside Daniel. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." Ethan hesitated. "When Sophie first introduced me to you two." Daniel smiled. "You thought we were boring." Ethan laughed. "I actually thought you had the healthiest marriage I'd ever seen." Daniel's smile faded slightly. "I know." Ethan looked embarrassed. "I hope that doesn't sound strange." "It doesn't. He searched for the right words. "You were always respectful. You never argued. You always supported each other." Daniel leaned another flattened box against the recycling bin. "Respect is important." "It is. But respect alone isn't enough." Ethan listened carefully. Daniel continued. "Don't mistake the absence of conflict for the presence of closeness." Those words surprised even Daniel. He realized he wasn't speaking only to Ethan. He was speaking to the younger version of himself. That evening, after returning home, Claire found Daniel sitting on the porch swing. The same swing that had witnessed proposals, pregnancy announcements, arguments, apologies, and years of silence. She sat beside him. Neither mentioned the past. Instead, Daniel asked, "What are you most excited about for Sophie's wedding?" Claire smiled immediately. "Watching her dance." "You always loved watching her dance." "She forgets the world when she dances." Daniel nodded. "I hope she never loses that." Claire looked at him, thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When was the last time you danced?" Daniel laughed. "I honestly don't remember." "You used to love it." "I wasn't very good." "You never cared." He smiled. "I had the right partner." Claire looked toward the fields beyond the porch. "So did I." A week later, Daniel attended one of Sophie's wedding planning meetings with Ethan. The young couple disagreed about something surprisingly small: the seating chart. Sophie wanted elderly relatives closer to the dance floor. Ethan preferred placing them near the exits for convenience. For nearly 10 minutes, they discussed it. Neither raised their voice. Neither interrupted. Finally, Ethan smiled. "You know what? We're arguing about people who will probably move their chairs anyway." Sophie burst into laughter. "You're probably right." They hugged. Conversation over. Driving home afterward, Daniel remained unusually quiet. Claire noticed. "What are you thinking?" "I just watched two people disagree." "And?" "They weren't afraid." Claire smiled gently. "No. They trusted that disagreement didn't threaten their relationship." Daniel nodded slowly. "I don't think we ever believed that." Claire looked out the window. "My parents taught me arguments destroyed families. And my father taught me feelings got in the way." She smiled sadly. "So we accidentally built a marriage where both of us avoided the very conversations we needed." Daniel sighed. "I wish we'd learned that sooner." Claire looked at him. "We're learning it now." The following Sunday, Daniel did something he hadn't done in almost 20 years. He asked Claire if she would like to attend a marriage workshop hosted by their church. Not because they were in crisis. Not because someone expected them to. Simply because they were finally talking again. Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "What do you think we'll learn after all these years?" Daniel smiled. "I honestly don't know." She studied his face. He wasn't trying to fix her. He wasn't trying to earn forgiveness. He genuinely wanted to keep growing. After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay." "Really?" "Really." Daniel smiled. "Thank you." Claire laughed softly. "You don't have to thank me every time I say yes." "I know. He looked down. "I'm still surprised every time Hope shows up." Claire's eyes filled with quiet emotion. "Hope. It had been a long time since either of them had allowed themselves to use that word, not because hope had disappeared, because it had become too painful to expect. Now, it returned carefully, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground after a long winter. Fragile, uncertain, alive, and sometimes, the smallest signs of new life are the ones worth protecting the most. Healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes, it looks like two people sitting beside each other in folding chairs, listening more than they speak. The following Thursday evening, Daniel and Claire walked into the fellowship hall of Maple Hollow Community Church for the marriage workshop. Neither of them knew what to expect. Daniel worried it might feel awkward. Claire worried it might feel unnecessary. Instead, it felt surprisingly ordinary. About 20 couples of all ages filled the room. Newlyweds sat beside couples celebrating 40 and 50 years together. Some held hands, some didn't. Some laughed easily. Others looked as nervous as Daniel felt. At the front of the room stood an elderly couple named George and Helen Whitaker, married for 53 years. George smiled warmly. "Good evening, everyone." Helen reached over and squeezed his hand. "We're not here because we've had a perfect marriage." George laughed. "If we had, none of you would believe anything we said." The room erupted in gentle laughter. The workshop wasn't filled with complicated advice. Instead, George asked everyone a simple question. "When was the last time you were curious about your spouse?" Several people exchanged confused glances. George smiled. Not polite. Not routine. Genuinely curious. He looked around the room. Most marriages don't stop because love disappears. They stop growing because curiosity disappears. Daniel felt those words settle deep inside him. Curiosity. When had he stopped asking Claire questions simply because he wanted to know her heart? When had she stopped believing it was safe enough to answer? Later, each couple received a small envelope. Inside were conversation cards. Daniel pulled the first one. "What is something you've never thanked your spouse for?" He looked across at Claire. She smiled faintly. "You go first." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I've never thanked you." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. "For protecting Sophie." Claire looked surprised. "You carried something no child should have carried." He continued quietly. "You never spoke badly about me. You never tried to make her choose sides. You gave her a peaceful childhood, even when your own heart wasn't peaceful." Claire lowered her eyes. Tears gathered silently. After a long moment she whispered, "Thank you." George walked past and smiled gently. No speeches. Just truth. Claire drew the next card. It read, "What do you admire most about the person sitting across from you today?" She looked at Daniel for a long time before answering. "I admire." Well, she searched for the right words. "That you never stopped becoming better." Daniel blinked. "I didn't always notice." "I know." She smiled softly. "But I did. You became more patient. You listen now. You don't rush people. You don't defend yourself the way you used to." She laughed quietly. "You even let me finish my stories." The room around them faded. Daniel felt something inside him break open. For 18 years he had believed Claire only saw his failure. Now he discovered she had also been quietly witnessing his growth. Driving home, neither turned on the radio. The silence inside the car no longer felt heavy. It felt comfortable. "Halfway home," Claire spoke. "I liked tonight." Daniel smiled. "So did I. I think we spent years talking around each other." "We did. And tonight." She looked out the windshield. "It felt like we were finally talking to each other." Daniel nodded. "I felt that too." The wedding arrived faster than anyone expected. The old farmhouse transformed into headquarters for relatives arriving from 3 different states. Suitcases lined the hallway. The refrigerator overflowed with food. Laughter echoed through every room. Claire's parents arrived first. Harold looked around proudly. "This house still smells like cinnamon." Claire laughed. "That's because Daniel insists every Saturday should start with cinnamon rolls." Harold looked at his son-in-law. "You finally learned something useful." Daniel grinned. "Took me a few decades." Even Evelyn noticed something had changed. While helping Claire arrange flowers, she leaned closer and whispered, "You seem lighter." Claire paused. "I feel lighter." Her mother smiled knowingly. Finally, the night before the wedding, Sophie couldn't sleep. She wandered downstairs just after midnight and found both her parents sitting on the porch. Daniel held a mug of coffee. Claire cradled a cup of chamomile tea. Neither had noticed the other couldn't sleep. They had simply ended up in the same place. Sophie smiled. "I knew I'd find you here." Daniel patted the empty chair beside him. "Nervous?" "A little." Claire laughed softly. That's normal. Sophie looked between them. Can I ask you both something? Daniel nodded. Anything. She hesitated. What do you think makes a marriage last? Daniel glanced toward Claire, then answered honestly. I used to think it was loyalty. Claire smiled gently. I used to think it was sacrifice. Sophie waited. Daniel continued. Now. I think it's honesty. Claire nodded. Honesty. And choosing to stay curious about each other. Sophie smiled. I like that. Then she asked the question that made both parents hold their breath. So, she looked from one to the other. Will you dance with each other tomorrow? The porch became perfectly still. Daniel looked at Claire. He didn't answer. He wouldn't answer for her. Claire looked down into her cup. Then toward the stars above the maple trees. Finally, she nodded. Yes. Sophie's face lit up instantly. She rushed forward and hugged both of them. Thank you. She kissed each of them on the cheek before running back inside. Daniel remained speechless. After the door closed, he turned slowly toward Claire. You don't have to. She smiled. I know. I don't want you doing it for Sophie. I'm not. He frowned slightly. Then why? Claire looked at him with a calm honesty he had come to treasure. Because, 18 years ago, I promised myself I'd never let you touch me again. She looked down at her own hands. I kept that promise. Then she looked back into his eyes. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to ask whether that promise was still helping either of us. Daniel felt tears filling his eyes. Claire reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was one of the old letters from the attic. She handed it to him. He recognized it immediately. The last letter he had written before their wedding. At the bottom he had written, no matter how lost we become, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to find my way back to you. Claire smiled through tears. You kept trying. Daniel whispered, I never stopped. Claire nodded. I know. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. No rush, no expectation, no pressure. Tomorrow would bring music, family, celebration, and one dance neither of them had imagined possible. Neither knew exactly what would happen when the music started, but for the first time in 18 years, both were willing to find out together. Some endings arrive with applause, others arrive with quiet understanding. Daniel Mercer had imagined this day hundreds of times. Sometimes he imagined Claire changing her mind. Sometimes he imagined himself standing alone while everyone politely pretended not to notice. Sometimes he imagined the music beginning and nothing happening at all. He stopped imagining after a while. Hope, he had learned, was gentler when it wasn't forced. Now, standing in the front row of the chapel as guests settled into polished wooden pews, he watched his daughter prepare to begin the next chapter of her life. For the first time in years, his heart wasn't consumed by regret. It was filled with gratitude. The small white chapel overlooked Lake Champlain. Sunlight streamed through tall stained glass windows, scattering warm colors across the polished floor. Rows of maple leaves, gathered from the surrounding hills, decorated each aisle. The atmosphere felt simple, elegant, peaceful. Exactly the kind of wedding Sophie had always wanted. Daniel adjusted his tie for what felt like the 20th time. Harold Brooks leaned over and smiled. Nervous? Daniel laughed quietly. A little. You should be. Harold looked toward the entrance. Giving away your daughter isn't easy. Daniel smiled. I already know I'm going to cry. Harold chuckled. Join the club. The music changed. Every guest stood. Daniel turned. There she was. Sophie. Her ivory gown shimmered softly beneath the afternoon light. She wasn't the little girl who used to ride on his shoulders through Maple Hollow's Harvest Festival anymore. She wasn't the teenager who filled notebooks with observations about people. She was a woman beginning her own family. Daniel felt tears blur his vision. Sophie smiled at him. The same warm smile Claire had worn on their wedding day all those years ago. Time, Daniel realized, had a beautiful way of repeating hope. The ceremony was filled with laughter more than tears. When the minister asked whether anyone had advice for the newly married couple, Harold raised his hand. Never go grocery shopping when you're hungry. The chapel erupted with laughter. Even the minister smiled. Ethan leaned toward Sophie. I think that's surprisingly good advice. It absolutely is. Then came the vows. Sophie looked into Ethan's eyes. I can't promise we'll never disagree. Daniel glanced toward Claire. She was listening intently. I can't promise we'll never disappoint each other. Claire quietly closed her eyes. But I promise this. Sophie's voice grew steadier. When something hurts, I'll tell you before silence teaches me to carry it alone. Daniel felt something catch in his throat. Claire's fingers tightened around the wedding program in her lap. Sophie continued, I want us to become the kind of couple who stays curious enough to keep finding each other. Daniel slowly turned toward Claire. She was already looking at him. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Those words had not come from a book. They had come from watching, learning, and choosing differently. In that moment, Daniel realized something remarkable. Their imperfect marriage had still taught their daughter wisdom. Not because they had done everything right, but because she had watched two imperfect people refuse to stop growing. The reception took place in a restored lakeside barn draped with white lights and autumn flowers. Children chased one another across the lawn. Older relatives reminisced around picnic tables. Music floated through the cool afternoon air. Daniel spent most of the afternoon greeting guests. Many commented on how happy he looked. He was, not because everything had been repaired, because he had finally stopped measuring life only by what had been broken. Later, Ethan tapped a spoon against his glass. I'd like to thank both our parents. He smiled toward Daniel and Claire. You've given us examples we'll carry into our own marriage. Daniel felt almost undeserving. Then Ethan added, not because you've been perfect, but because you've shown us that love is something people choose again and again. Claire lowered her eyes. Daniel quietly wiped away another tear. After dinner, the band leader stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for our family dances. Soft applause filled the room. Sophie danced first with Daniel. Halfway through the song, she whispered, You've always made me feel safe. Daniel blinked back tears. I learned that from your mom. She smiled. I think you both taught me. When the song ended, Sophie hugged him tightly. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Peanut. Always. Next came the mother-daughter dance. Claire held Sophie close. Neither spoke much. Neither needed to. Sometimes mothers and daughters understand each other without language. When the music faded, guests applauded warmly. The bandleader smiled. And now. He looked toward Daniel and Claire. Our bride has one final request. The room grew noticeably quieter. Sophie stepped to the microphone. I've dreamed about this moment since I was little. She looked at both parents. You've always been my heroes. Daniel lowered his eyes. Claire looked almost overwhelmed. I know marriage isn't perfect. Sophie smiled. I don't expect perfection. She laughed softly. I just know that love is worth celebrating. She held out one hand toward her father, the other toward her mother. Dance with each other. Silence. No one clapped. No one spoke. Every guest simply waited. Daniel looked at Claire. He didn't move. He had promised himself months earlier that he would never pressure her again. If she said no, he would understand. Claire stood completely still. The room disappeared around her. She remembered another dance floor, another wedding, another promise, another lifetime. Then she remembered 18 years of silence. She remembered every morning Daniel had quietly made coffee, every birthday he had remembered, every patient he had listened to her grieve, every soccer game, every graduation, every ordinary Tuesday he had shown up. Not perfectly, faithfully. She slowly walked toward him. Gasps rippled softly through the room. Daniel's heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. Claire stopped only a few inches away. She looked into his eyes. You still don't know how to dance. Daniel laughed through tears. No, I never will. A faint smile appeared. Good. Then, for the first time in 18 years, Claire reached for him. Not because anyone expected it, not because the guests were watching, not because Sophie had asked, but because somewhere between truth, patience, accountability, and time, fear had finally loosened its grip. She gently placed one hand in his. The ballroom became perfectly still. No applause, no cheering, only quiet. The kind of quiet that carries healing instead of hurt. Daniel looked at their joined hands. He didn't pull her closer. He didn't assume anything. He simply whispered, Thank you. Claire smiled. Don't thank me. The music began, and for the first time in 18 years, they allowed themselves to move in the same direction. The dance was slow, not because of the music, because neither Daniel nor Claire wanted to rush a moment that had taken 18 years to arrive. Daniel's right hand rested gently against the middle of Claire's back. Not possessively, not confidently, almost as though he were asking permission with every step. Claire noticed. She smiled softly. You still ask before you move. Daniel looked at her. I've learned that some things should never be assumed. I nodded. That's a good lesson. It cost me enough to learn it. For a moment, neither spoke again. The music carried them quietly across the dance floor, while friends and family respectfully looked away, giving them a privacy they hadn't expected in the middle of a crowded celebration. Sophie stood beside Ethan near the edge of the dance floor. Her eyes shimmered with tears. "I've never seen them like this." Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I don't think they have either." Harold slipped his hand into Evelyn's. Evelyn smiled through quiet tears. "They're finally dancing." Harold looked at his wife. "No." He squeezed her hand gently. "They're finally talking." As the song ended, Daniel instinctively began to step back. Claire surprised him. She didn't let go immediately. Their hands remained together for one more heartbeat. Then another. Finally, she released his hand on her own terms. Not out of fear. Not because she needed distance. Simply because the dance had ended. Daniel understood. For the first time in years, he didn't mistake an ending for a rejection. Some moments are complete exactly as they are. The reception continued late into the evening. Children chased one another beneath strings of lights. Grandparents reminisced. Old friends laughed over stories that had grown more exaggerated with every passing year. The atmosphere felt lighter than anyone could remember. Daniel found himself standing alone near the lake just before sunset. The water reflected streaks of gold and crimson across its calm surface. A familiar voice spoke behind him. "You always disappear when parties get loud." He turned. Claire, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. "You remembered." She smiled. "I always remembered." They both laughed. It was such a small exchange, yet it carried the warmth of memories stretching back decades. They sat together on an old wooden bench overlooking the lake. For a while, neither said anything. This silence felt different, not because silence itself had become good, but because it no longer carried hidden fear. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I've imagined today so many times." Claire smiled. "So have I. My version was never this peaceful." "Mine wasn't either." He looked down into his coffee. "I used to think if we ever made it here, it would feel like winning." Claire looked thoughtfully across the water. "It doesn't feel like winning." "No. It feels like..." She searched for the right words. "Finally putting down something we've both been carrying." Daniel nodded slowly. "I think you're right." Later that evening, as guests began saying their goodbyes, Sophie hugged both parents tightly. "Thank you." Daniel smiled. "For what?" "For believing love is still worth working for." Claire brushed a loose strand of hair behind Sophie's ear. "We didn't always know how." "I know." Sophie smiled. "But you kept trying." She looked at both of them. "That's what I'll remember. Not the silence, not the distance, not even the pain. She would remember the courage to keep growing." It was exactly the lesson Daniel and Claire had hoped to teach, though neither had realized it until now. The weeks after the wedding settled into a quieter rhythm. The farmhouse felt larger without Sophie's laughter echoing down the hallway. Her bedroom remained exactly as she had left it. Claire occasionally stepped inside just to straighten a pillow that didn't need straightening. Daniel found himself making too much coffee each morning. Old habits lingered. One rainy Saturday afternoon, while cleaning the attic again, Daniel discovered something tucked inside the cedar box of letters. A small envelope addressed in Claire's handwriting. It simply read, "For the day we find each other again." His heart began racing. He carried it downstairs. Claire looked up from the sofa. "You found it." "I didn't know it was there." She smiled. "I forgot about it." He held up the unopened envelope. "Should I?" She looked at it for a long moment, then nodded. "I think it's time." Inside was a single folded page. Daniel unfolded it carefully. The date at the top stopped him. It had been written less than a month after she discovered the affair. His hands trembled as he read. "Dear Danny, if you're reading this, then maybe we've finally become brave enough to stop pretending. I don't know whether I'll ever be able to touch you again. I honestly don't know if that part of me will survive what happened. But I hope something else survives. I hope one day we become 2 people who tell each other the truth before silence has a chance to grow. If that day ever comes, don't ask me to become the woman I was before. She'll never exist again. Just love the woman I've become. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to love the man you choose to become too. Claire." Daniel lowered the letter. He couldn't speak. Claire sat beside him quietly. "I wrote it the week after everything happened. Why didn't you give it to me?" She smiled sadly. "Because I wasn't ready." "And now?" She reached over and gently folded the letter closed. "Now I think we finally understand it." Months passed. Winter slowly surrendered to spring once again. One Sunday evening, Daniel stood on the porch watching the sun disappear beyond the Vermont hills. Claire joined him carrying 2 mugs of tea. Without thinking, she sat beside him on the old porch swing. The swing still leaned ever so slightly to the left. Neither of them bothered fixing it anymore. Some imperfections become part of a story. Daniel smiled. It still leans. Claire laughed. So do we. He chuckled softly. Probably always will. They watched the fireflies appear one by one across the backyard. Then, almost absent-mindedly, Claire rested her hand on the swing between them. Not reaching, simply resting. Daniel looked down. He didn't move. A few moments later, Claire quietly turned her hand over, palm upward. An invitation, nothing more. Daniel looked at her. She gave the smallest nod. He gently placed his hand in hers. Their fingers intertwined naturally. There was no dramatic music, no audience, no grand declaration of everlasting love. Only two imperfect people sitting on a slightly crooked porch swing, watching another Vermont sunset. After a long, peaceful silence, Daniel smiled and asked, "So, are we starting over?" Claire looked at their joined hands, then at the horizon glowing with the last light of day. She smiled the kind of smile he had fallen in love with all those years ago. "No." She squeezed his hand gently. "We're finally starting honestly." The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh pine and blooming lilacs across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang softly through the valley. The silence between them remained, but it no longer hid fear. It no longer carried secrets. It no longer separated two hearts. Now it was simply the quiet comfort of two people who had learned one of life's hardest lessons. Love isn't sustained by pretending nothing goes wrong. Love survives when truth is spoken before silence hardens into distance. And sometimes, the greatest act of forgiveness isn't forgetting the past. It's choosing not to let the past write the final chapter. The end. Final reflection. Every marriage will face moments of disappointment, misunderstanding, and pain. The difference between relationships that quietly fade and those that endure is not the absence of mistakes. It is the willingness to communicate before silence becomes a permanent resident. Trust, once broken, may never look exactly the same again. But honesty, humility, patience, accountability, and consistent love can build something different. Something perhaps less naive, yet stronger because it is rooted in truth. If this story touched your heart, remember this lesson. Never let unspoken pain become the loudest voice in your relationship. Sometimes one honest conversation today can prevent 18 years of silence tomorrow. We've reached the end of Daniel and Claire's journey, but now I'd love to hear from you. If you were in Claire's position, could you have stayed after the betrayal? And if you were Daniel, what would you have done differently to rebuild trust? Share your thoughts in the comments below. One of the most beautiful things about this community is that we learn from each other's experiences, and your perspective might encourage someone who needs it today. If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another heartfelt story filled with love, life lessons, and hope. And if there's one lesson to take away from Daniel and Claire's story, let it be this. Love isn't measured by never making mistakes. It's measured by the courage to tell the truth, the humility to change, and the willingness to keep choosing each other before silence becomes stronger than love. Thank you for spending this journey with us. Until next time, take care of your heart. And don't leave the important words unsaid.